Trent Halford's meaty hand clamped down on Morgan's wrist like a rusted iron vise, the skin-to-skin contact sending a jolt of primal repulsion through her system that she fought to keep off her face. He leaned in close, far too close, bringing with him the suffocating, cloying stench of high-end bourbon and poor decisions. His breath was a hot, humid mist against her cheek, and his eyes, glassy with a mixture of alcohol and unearned confidence, searched hers for a flicker of fear that simply wasn't there. He had that entitled smirk plastered across his jaw, the kind of expression worn by men who had spent their entire lives being told that the world was their personal playground and every person in it was a toy for their amusement. "Come on, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice thick and sluggish. "Don't be like that. We just want to have some fun with you. Why you gotta be so cold?" His fingers dug deeper, his nails biting into the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, leaving crescent moon indentations that would undoubtedly turn into bruises by morning. To his left and right, his two companions shifted their weight, flanking him like low-rent bodyguards. They laughed, a synchronized, hollow sound that didn't reach their eyes that gleamed with the specific brand of cruelty common to those who have never faced a single consequence for their actions. They moved to block her exit from the booth, their shadows stretching long across the scarred wood of the table, effectively caging her in. Morgan Vale didn't flinch. She didn't pull away and she didn't cry out. 16 years in the Navy SEALs had carved a specific kind of patience into her bones, a cold, calculated control that allowed her to exist in the heartbeat between a threat and the response. She knew exactly when to strike, exactly how much force was required to neutralize a target, and exactly how it felt to watch the light of arrogance fade from a man's eyes when he realized he had chosen the wrong victim. But what these three drunk idiots didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom as they violated her personal space and treated her body as a prop in their evening's entertainment, was that they had just committed the single biggest mistake of their miserable, sheltered lives. They saw a woman alone in a booth, a quiet figure in a simple jacket who looked like an easy target for a bit of midweek harassment. They didn't see the Tier 1 operator who had survived the frozen hell of BUD/S, who had navigated the pitch-black waters of the Persian Gulf, and who had walked through the fire of Fallujah without breaking a sweat. Morgan had chosen this specific corner booth with the same tactical precision she used to choose a sniper's hide. Old habits didn't just die hard, they became the architecture of her soul. Always face the entrance. Always know where the kitchen door leads. Always identify at least 3 improvised weapons within arm's reach. Even now, in the supposed safety of Clearwater, Idaho, she couldn't turn it off. She was trying to eat a damn steak in peace, trying to enjoy the simple civilian pleasure of a meal she didn't have to eat out of a plastic pouch. Yet here she was, mapping out the room's geometry and calculating the weight of the heavy glass salt shaker on the table. The Langston Grill wasn't a fancy establishment, but it possessed a rugged, honest charm that Morgan had found herself drawn to. It featured red leather booths worn smooth by decades of use, the kind of material that felt like home even if you'd never been there before. The dark wood paneling on the walls seemed to absorb both sound and light, creating an atmosphere of muffled intimacy. It was the sort of place where locals came to drown their sorrows in gravy, and where the waitstaff could tell how your day was going just by the way you held your fork. Morgan had been in Clearwater for exactly 6 weeks, and in that time she had visited the Langston Grill 3 times. Each visit was a carbon copy of the last. Same booth, same order, ribeye, medium rare, and a loaded baked potato. Each time she sat there and performed the mental gymnastics required to convince herself that civilian life was a transition she was actually capable of making. She told herself she liked the quiet. She told herself she didn't miss the hum of a C-130 or the weight of a rifle in her hands. Each time, she knew she was lying to herself. The silence of Idaho was deafening. It was a vacuum that her mind tried to fill with the sounds of things she had left behind. The rhythmic thud of rotor blades, the sharp crack of outgoing fire, the frantic voices over the comms. "Can I get you anything else, hun?" The voice broke through her reverie. It belonged to Linda, a waitress who had to be pushing 70 but moved with the crisp, efficient grace of a career soldier. Linda had already brought Morgan's usual without being asked, a silent acknowledgement of the routine Morgan so desperately clung to. Morgan looked up, offering a small nod. "I'm good, thank you, Linda." The older woman's eyes lingered on Morgan's face for a second too long. It was that look, The one civilians gave veterans when they were trying to solve a puzzle they didn't have all the pieces for. They sensed the hardness beneath the surface, the distance in the eyes that suggested Morgan was looking at them through bulletproof glass. It was a psychic barrier, a wall built from experiences that couldn't be translated into the language of the everyday. "You sure?" Linda asked, her voice dropping an octave, laced with a maternal concern that made Morgan's chest tighten. "You look like you could use a drink, something stronger than that water." Morgan managed a tight, polite smile, the kind she kept in her social arsenal for exactly these moments. "Water's fine. I'm trying to keep a clear head." The truth was far more complicated. Morgan hadn't touched a drop of alcohol in 4 months. Not since the day of her retirement ceremony, when the sun had beaten down on the tarmac at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado and Captain Richards had handed her a folded flag. She could still feel the phantom weight of that flag, could still see the tears in the captain's eyes as he thanked her for 16 years of service that the public would never truly know about. She remembered walking out of the gates for the last time, the click of the turnstile sounding like a finality she wasn't prepared for. In that moment, she realized she had no idea who Morgan Vale was without the teams. Without the mission, she was just a collection of scars and muscle memory wandering through a world that felt increasingly alien. She turned her attention back to the steak. The knife slid through the meat with effortless ease, a testament to the kitchen's skill. It was perfect, or it should have been. But as she chewed, she realized she couldn't really taste it. The flavors were muted like everything else in this new existence. Her life had become a series of mechanical motions designed to stave off the darkness. Wake up at 0500. Run 6 miles until her lungs burned. Eat. Stare at the beige walls of her rental house. Try not to think about the men she'd lost. Try not to hear Sanchez's voice cracking a joke seconds before the world turned into fire and dust. Try not to wonder if the ones who made it back were staring at their own walls, feeling the same hollow ache of obsolescence. The bell above the entrance chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that set Morgan's internal alarms ringing. Her eyes flicked up automatically, a conditioned reflex she could no more suppress than a heartbeat. Threat assessment began instantly. 3 males, late 20s to mid-30s. The leader, the one who would later introduce himself as Trent, moved with a swagger that was practically a billboard for unearned privilege. He wore designer jeans and a polo shirt with the collar popped, a look that screamed, "My father owns the bank." He had that specific brand of confidence that came from a lifetime of being protected from the jagged edges of reality. Behind him were 2 others, larger and broader, with the vacant, eager expressions of loyal dogs waiting for a command. They were followers, the kind of men who bolstered their own fragile identities by tethering themselves to someone with money and a loud voice. Morgan watched them slide into a booth just 3 tables down from hers. They were loud from the start, their voices cutting through the low hum of the restaurant like a chainsaw. Trent snapped his fingers at Linda, a gesture so dismissive it made Morgan's blood simmer. "Hey, sweetheart, 3 whiskeys, top shelf, and don't make us wait." Linda's jaw tightened, a brief flash of resentment crossing her face before she smoothed it over with professional neutrality. She nodded and turned toward the bar. Morgan felt her own muscles coil, the familiar hum of adrenaline beginning to vibrate in her marrow. She forced herself to take a deep breath, focusing on the texture of the baked potato. "Not your problem," she told herself. "Just a few more bites, pay the bill, and get out. Mind your business." But the part of her brain that had been trained to catalog threats refused to disengage. She heard the name Trent Halford dropped by one of the lackeys, and while the name meant nothing to her, his behavior told the whole story. He was a small-town prince, a man who viewed the world as a series of obstacles he could either buy or bully his way through. "So I told him," Trent's voice boomed, intentionally loud so the entire room could hear of his business prowess. "I told him if those permits aren't on my desk by Friday, he's out. I don't care whose cousin he is. Money talks, and I'm the one screaming." His friends erupted in practiced laughter, leaning in as if they were sharing a secret with a king. Morgan tried to focus on the comfort food. The butter, the sour cream, the salty crunch of the bacon bits. This meal was supposed to be a quiet celebration, a way to mark her 6-week anniversary of staying out of trouble. 16 years of service, 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star. A chest full of medals that represented the highest honors her country could bestow, yet in this room, she was just a woman in a corner booth, invisible to everyone except the predators looking for a target. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from her right. One of the enforcers had stood up and walked over. He had a thick neck and small, suspicious eyes, the kind of guy who had peaked in high school as a linebacker and spent every year since trying to recapture that feeling of physical dominance. He jerked a thumb back toward Trent, who was watching with a predatory grin. "My friend over there, he wanted to know if you'd like to join us for a drink. He's feeling generous tonight." "No, thank you." Morgan's voice was flat, a perfect neutral tone. It was the same voice she had used with tribal elders in the mountains of Afghanistan, calm, respectful, but carrying an underlying edge that warned of deep waters. The man's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Come on, don't be like that. Trent's a good guy, real important around here. He could show you a side of this town you haven't seen yet. Might even make your night interesting. I'm fine where I am, thank you." Morgan didn't look up from her plate, but she could see the man's hands clenching at his sides. He wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially not from someone he perceived as being lower on the social food chain. "Look, lady, I'm trying to be nice here," the man said, his voice dropping into a low growl. "We're offering you a seat at the best table in the house. You shouldn't be so stuck up." "I appreciate the offer," Morgan said, finally looking him in the eye. The intensity of her gaze made him take a half step back, though he likely couldn't have explained why. "But I'm not interested. I'd like to finish my dinner in peace." The calculation in his eyes was visible. He was weighing his options, deciding if he should push further or retreat. He was clearly insulted, his ego bruised by the rejection. Before he could escalate, Linda appeared like a guardian angel, a coffee pot in one hand and a look of steel in her eyes. "Is there a problem over here?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. The enforcer's face rearranged itself into a mask of fake friendliness. "No problem at all, Linda, just being neighborly." "Well, why don't you go be neighborly at your own table? These folks are here to eat, not to be hounded by you lot." He retreated, but the look he shot Morgan over his shoulder was a promise of future trouble. She watched him lean down and whisper into Trent's ear, watched the way Trent's face hardened, the way his eyes narrowed as he locked onto her. All three of them were staring now, a collective weight of hostility that made the air in the restaurant feel thick and heavy. Morgan knew she should leave. A smart civilian would have signaled for the check, paid, and slipped out the door before the situation could boil over. But Morgan was tired. She was exhausted from the constant running, the endless avoidance of conflict that seemed to be the primary requirement of her new life. She was tired of pretending to be a soft, vulnerable thing just to make the people around her feel comfortable. So she stayed. She took another bite of her steak, chewing slowly, meeting Trent's gaze with a level of indifference that she knew would infuriate him more than any insult. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Hayes, one of the few men from her old unit who still reached out. "How's the civilian life treating you? Living the dream yet?" Morgan stared at the screen for a long time. She thought about the silence of her house, the way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and the three men currently plotting her downfall across the room. "It's everything I dreamed it would be," she typed back. Hayes would know it was a lie. He had been her swim buddy through the grueling hell of BUD/S, the one who had literally held her head above water when her strength failed. He had pulled her out of a burning compound in Ramadi, and she had held him while he wept after they lost Sanchez. He had told her at the retirement ceremony that she was making a mistake, that people like them weren't meant for the quiet life. He told her she was a weapon, and weapons didn't belong in a drawer, they belonged in the field. Hayes texted back instantly, "Come back. We're heading out in 2 weeks. The team isn't the same without you." Morgan didn't reply. She couldn't. There was no going back, only forward into the unknown. At the other table, the noise level was rising. Trent was performing for his audience now, his voice dripping with venom. "She thinks she's too good for us," he said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to shift uncomfortably. "Probably one of those city feminists who thinks she can come into our town and look down her nose at everyone. Needs someone to teach her some manners, show her how we do things in Clearwater." Morgan set her fork down with a soft click. She wiped her mouth with her napkin, her mind shifting into a high-speed tactical analysis. She measured the distance to the front door, 20 feet. The kitchen entrance was 15 feet in the opposite direction. There were 3 targets. Trent was the primary, the loudmouth who provided the motivation, but the 2 enforcers were the physical threats. If she took out the leader, the others might fold, or they might become unpredictable. She needed to be ready for either outcome. She felt the familiar cooling of her blood, the way her peripheral vision seemed to expand, the way every sound in the room became distinct and categorized. Linda returned to the table, her hand resting briefly on Morgan's shoulder. "You okay, hun? Those boys are getting a bit carried away. I can call the sheriff if you want." "I'm fine, Linda," Morgan said, her voice steady and low. "I've handled worse than them." Linda looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second it seemed like she saw the truth. She didn't see a victim, she saw a storm waiting to happen. You just be careful. Those Halfords think they own the dirt this town is built on. Morgan reached into her wallet and pulled out a $50 bill, leaving it on the table. It was more than enough to cover the meal and a generous tip. She began to stand, her movements slow and deliberate, when she heard the heavy scrape of a chair being pushed back. The sound of boots on the hardwood floor approached her booth with aggressive intent. She didn't turn around until she felt them hovering behind her. "Hey, we're talking to you, princess." Trent's voice was sharp, demanding. Morgan turned slowly, her expression a mask of bored detachment. The three of them had fanned out, blocking her path to the exit. It was amateur hour, the classic intimidation tactic used by those who have watched too many movies and fought too few real battles. They thought they had her trapped. They thought the walls of the booth were their allies. They had no idea they had just walked into a kill zone with a predator who didn't know how to quit. "Excuse me," Morgan said, her voice quiet but carrying a strange resonance that caused a few people at nearby tables to look up. "I'd like to leave now." Trent's smile was a jagged thing, full of malice and a desperate need for dominance. "What's the rush? We were just getting to know each other. I don't think you've apologized yet for being so rude to my friend." "I don't have anything to say to you," Morgan replied. "Move aside." Trent laughed, a harsh, braying sound. "Or what? You gonna call your boyfriend? You gonna cry?" He stepped closer, the smell of bourbon now a physical weight. "You don't seem to understand how things work here. My name is Trent Halford. My family built this town. That means when I want to talk to someone, they listen. And when I want someone to stay, they stay." Morgan could feel the entire restaurant go still. The clinking of silverware stopped. The low murmur of conversation died away. She could see Linda reaching for the wall-mounted phone behind the bar, her fingers trembling. She could see the other diners frozen in a state of bystander paralysis, their eyes wide with the fear of getting involved. Morgan had been in far worse situations than this. She had faced down armed insurgents in the ruins of Mosul, had cleared tunnels in the mountains of Tora Bora where the air was thick with the smell of cordite and death. These three men, with their expensive clothes and their fragile egos, were nothing more than a nuisance. But she gave them one last chance to walk away. "Please," she said, the word feeling like a foreign object in her mouth. "Just let me leave." It was a tactical please, a deliberate move to establish her as the victim for any potential witnesses. She wanted it on the record that she had tried to de-escalate. Trent took it as a sign of weakness. His hand shot out, his fingers clamping onto her wrist like a trap. He yanked her forward, forcing her to stumble out of the booth, pulling her close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his nose and the sweat beading on his forehead. "You don't say please to me," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You don't say anything until I tell you to. You're going to sit back down, you're going to drink what I tell you to drink, and you're going to learn some respect." In that moment, the world slowed down. Morgan felt her training take over, a biological override that pushed the civilian world into the background. The Morgan, who tried to live in a rental house and eat steak in peace, vanished, replaced by the operator who had been forged in the fires of the most elite training program on Earth. The adrenaline hit her system like a lightning strike, sharpening her senses until she could hear the individual beats of Trent's heart. "Let go of my wrist," she said, her voice dropping into a register that was devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a machine, or what? Trent squeezed harder, his thumb grinding into the bone. "What are you gonna do, bitch?" "I'm going to give you to the count of 3, Morgan said. 1, Trent's grin widened. He looked at his friends, seeking their approval. "You hear that? She's counting. I'm so scared. 2. The enforcer on her left shifted his weight, preparing to grab her other arm. Morgan tracked the movement in her periphery, her brain calculating the trajectory and the force required to break his grip. She knew the exact moment his muscles would fire. 3. Trent started to say something, but the words died in his throat as Morgan moved. It was a blur of motion, a sequence of strikes so fast and precise that the human eye struggled to register them. Her free hand came up, her fingers striking the pressure point on Trent's wrist with surgical accuracy. His hand spasmed, his grip failing instantly. In the same fluid motion, Morgan rotated her captured arm, slipping free, and drove her palm into Trent's solar plexus. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was delivered with enough force to collapse his lungs and send him staggering back, his face turning a sickly shade of purple as he fought for air. The enforcer on her left lunged, his movements slow and telegraphed. Morgan didn't even wait for him to reach her. She sidestepped his clumsy grab, using his own momentum against him. She placed a hand on the small of his back and guided him headfirst into the edge of the heavy wooden booth. The sound of his skull meeting the oak was a dull thud that echoed through the silent room. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second enforcer was more cautious. He saw his friends go down and realized far too late that they were out of their depth. He came in with his hands up, trying to grapple, trying to use his superior size to pin her against the wall. Morgan let him get close, let him think he had a chance. As his hands reached for her shoulders, she snapped her head forward, the crown of her forehead connecting with the bridge of his nose. The crunch of breaking bone was sickeningly loud. As he recoiled, his hands flying to his face to stem the flow of blood, Morgan hooked his lead leg and swept it out from under him. He hit the floor hard, the air leaving his lungs in a wheezing gasp. The entire engagement had lasted exactly 4 seconds. Morgan stood in the center of the wreckage, her breathing steady, her heart rate barely elevated. She felt a strange sense of clarity, a homecoming she hadn't expected. This was the only place she truly felt alive, in the heart of the storm, where the rules of the civilized world were stripped away and all that remained was the raw reality of violence and survival. But as the adrenaline began to recede, she felt the eyes of the room on her. She looked around and saw the expressions of horror and awe on the faces of the other diners. She saw the cell phones held aloft, recording her every move. She saw Linda still holding the phone, her mouth hanging open in shock. Trent was on his knees now, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Do you have any idea who my father is?" he wheezed, the threat sounding pathetic in the wake of such absolute physical dominance. "I don't care if your father is the president," Morgan said, her voice cold and echoing. "You laid hands on me. You threatened me. That was your mistake. I'm going to sue you. I'll destroy your life." Trent's voice was getting stronger, the arrogance returning as he realized he was still alive. Morgan almost laughed. Destroy her life. Her life was already a series of shattered fragments. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side with nothing but a set of skills that made her a monster in the eyes of people like him. "You can't destroy what's already gone," she said quietly. In the distance, the first wail of a siren broke the silence. It grew louder, the rhythmic pulsing of emergency lights beginning to flash against the windows of the grill. Red and blue strobes danced across the dark wood and the red leather, turning the restaurant into a surreal, chaotic landscape. Morgan didn't move. She didn't try to run. She stood perfectly still, her hands visible, her posture relaxed but ready. She knew the drill. She knew how the police would see this. A woman in the middle of 3 injured men. She knew the narrative they would try to build. The front door burst open and 2 officers entered, their hands on their holsters but their weapons not yet drawn. The younger one looked wide-eyed and nervous, his gaze darting between the bodies on the floor and the woman standing over them. The older officer, a man with a graying mustache and the tired eyes of a veteran cop, took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. "Nobody move!" The younger officer shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Relax, kid," the older officer said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Morgan. "You want to tell me what happened here, miss?" "He attacked me," Morgan said, gesturing toward Trent. "I defended myself." "She's lying," Trent shrieked, finally finding his feet. "She went crazy. We were just talking and she started hitting us. Look at my friends. She's a maniac." The older officer walked over to Trent, looking down at him with a weary patience. "Why don't you sit back down and shut up for a minute, Trent? I've dealt with you enough to know that just talking usually involves you being a nuisance." "But she broke Dave's nose, and look at Steve. He's out cold." The officer turned back to Morgan. "That's a lot of damage for one woman to do," he said, his tone neutral. "You have some training." Morgan reached into her back pocket, her movements slow and telegraphed so as not to spook the younger cop. She pulled out her wallet and produced her driver's license. "I moved here 6 weeks ago," she said. "I'm a retired Navy SEAL, 16 years of service." The silence that followed was even deeper than the one after the fight. The younger officer actually lowered his hand from his belt, his eyes going wide. "A SEAL? For real?" Morgan nodded. She saw the shift in the older officer's demeanor. The suspicion didn't vanish, but it was replaced by a professional respect. He took the license and studied it, then looked at Morgan's face, comparing the two. "You're Vale, the one who bought the old Miller place up on the ridge. That's me." The officer sighed and handed the license back. "Well, Miss Vale, we've got about 20 people in here who were recording the whole thing. My guess is the videos aren't going to back up Trent's version of events." Trent's face went pale. He looked around the room, seeing the phones pointed at him, seeing the judgmental glares of his neighbors. For the first time in his life, the shield of his family name wasn't enough to protect him from the reality of his own actions. Linda stepped forward from behind the bar, her voice trembling but firm. "She's telling the truth, Officer Miller. Those boys wouldn't leave her alone. They were hounding her the whole time she was eating, and then Trent grabbed her. He wouldn't let go. She told him to stop, and he just got meaner." The officer nodded. "All right. We'll need statements from everyone. Miss Vale, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to fill out some paperwork. Given the circumstances, I don't think we'll be looking at any charges for you, but we have to follow the process." Morgan felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. She looked at the wreckage of her dinner, at the half-eaten steak and the spilled water. This was the peace she had moved to Idaho for. This was the quiet life she had promised herself. She realized then that Hayes had been right. You could take the warrior out of the war, but you could never take the war out of the warrior. It lived in her blood, in her bones, in the way she moved through the world. As she walked out of the Langston Grill, escorted by the officers, the cool Idaho air hit her face. It was crisp and smelled of pine and rain. She looked up at the stars, which were brilliant and uncaring in the vast blackness of the sky. For a moment, she felt a strange sense of relief. The mask had slipped, and the world had seen what she truly was. There was no more pretending. She climbed into the back of the patrol car, the metal of the door closing with a heavy, final sound. Through the window, she saw Trent being loaded into an ambulance, his face buried in his hands. He would recover, and his father would undoubtedly hire the best lawyers money could buy. But Morgan knew that something had changed tonight. Clearwater wasn't the sanctuary she thought it was, and she wasn't the civilian she had tried to be. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, its lights still flashing, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the quiet streets of the town. Morgan leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She thought of Hayes, of the teams, and of the mission that was waiting for them in 2 weeks. She thought of the cold water of the Pacific and the heat of the desert. And for the first time in 4 months, she felt like she knew exactly who she was. She was Morgan Vale, and the war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow clarity that Morgan Vale knew all too well. It was the after-action silence, a familiar companion from a dozen different theaters of war, though it felt entirely out of place in a wood-paneled steakhouse in the heart of Idaho. The older officer, a man whose face was etched with the weary lines of a career spent patrolling small-town streets, looked from the 3 men groaning on the floor back to Morgan. He didn't see a victim, and he certainly didn't see a typical civilian. He saw a professional. He sighed, the sound heavy with the anticipation of the paperwork this night would require. He asked if she needed medical attention, but Morgan just felt the faint throb of a bruised knuckle. It was nothing compared to the wreckage of the men at her feet. She told him it was just a bruised ego mostly, and the officer nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the way she stood, balanced, centered, ready for a second round that would never come. "All right, Miss Vale, you're free to go," the officer said, his voice dropping into a register of reluctant respect. He turned his attention to the 3 men, his hand dropping to the heavy belt at his waist. He pointed a gloved finger at Trent Halford and his 2 companions, who were only just beginning to find their feet and their voices. "You 3 are coming with us," he barked. "Public intoxication, assault, and disturbing the peace. We'll start there and see what else sticks once we get to the station." Trent, his face a mottled mask of rage and swelling bruises, wasn't going quietly. He shoved against the officer's guiding hand, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate indignation. "This is a mistake," he shouted, the sound echoing off the ceiling fans and the silent, watching patrons. "My father is Harlan Halford. Do you have any idea who he is? He owns half this county. He pays your salary, you pathetic little man. You can't arrest me." The older officer didn't even blink. He'd clearly heard the "do you know who my father is" speech 100 times before. "Watch me," he muttered, spinning Trent around and ratcheting a pair of steel cuffs onto his wrists with a definitive metallic click. Morgan watched the scene with a detached coldness. She reached down and gathered her jacket from the back of her chair, her movements fluid and economical. She felt a presence at her elbow and turned to see Linda, the waitress who had been caught in the crossfire of the evening's tension. Linda looked shaken, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her apron, but there was a fierce spark of gratitude in her eyes. "You didn't even touch your steak, honey," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of Trent's continued shouting. "I lost my appetite," Morgan replied, looking down at the perfectly seared meat that now seemed like a relic from a different life. "I'll box it up for you," Linda said quickly. "On the house. It's the least I can do. And hun," Linda reached out, her hand resting briefly, gently on Morgan's forearm. The touch was warm and human, a stark contrast to the violence of the last few minutes. "Thank you, truly. I've been dealing with those boys and their nonsense for years. Everyone in this town has. They think they own the air we breathe just because of that name. It was about time someone finally put them in their place. It was about time someone showed them they aren't untouchable." Morgan accepted the heavy takeout container, the warmth of the food seeping through the styrofoam. She didn't know how to respond to the gratitude, so she simply nodded and turned toward the door. As she walked, the restaurant fell into a suffocating sort of silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware and the distant sirens. Every eye in the place followed her. She could hear the whispers starting behind her, a low hum of speculation and awe. She could feel the heat of dozens of phone screens pointed at her back, the tiny lenses capturing her retreat. She could sense the story already shifting, taking on a life of its own as it was uploaded to the cloud, destined to be dissected by strangers who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the air thicken with the threat of violence. Outside, the cool Idaho air hit her face like a physical weight. It was crisp and smelled of pine and damp pavement, a sharp cleanser after the stale grease and tension of the grill. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her breath blooming in small white clouds, and watched the officers load the three men into separate squad cars. The blue and red lights splashed against the brick buildings of the town square, turning the quiet street into a surreal stage. Trent was still shouting through the glass of the cruiser, his face pressed against the window, screaming about lawyers, about retribution, about how Morgan would regret the day she ever stepped foot in Clearwater. Morgan didn't regret it. Not yet. A part of her, the part that had spent 16 years in the shadows of the world's most dangerous places, told her she should have been smarter. She should have walked away when the first insult was hurled. She should have avoided the confrontation, should have played the role of the quiet, invisible civilian she had worked so hard to become. But another part of her, the part that had survived BUD/S and deployments to places that didn't exist on maps, was simply tired. She was tired of walking away from bullies, tired of making herself small so that others could feel large, tired of pretending she was something other than the finely honed instrument of war that the Navy had spent millions of dollars to create. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp, insistent vibration. She pulled it out, the screen glowing brightly against the darkness of the street. It was a text from Hayes. He was 1,000 miles away, yet he was always the first to know when the world was tilting off its axis. "Just saw the video," the message read. "That was you at the restaurant, wasn't it?" Morgan stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the glass. How the hell did Hayes already have the video? She'd left the restaurant maybe 10 minutes ago. She hadn't even reached her truck yet. Before she could type a response, another text came through, the notification banner sliding down like a guillotine. "It's already got 50,000 views," Hayes wrote. "Your viral veil. Welcome to civilian life, Morgan. Hope you brought an umbrella for the storm." Morgan closed her eyes and leaned her head back against a cold lamppost. This was not how she had wanted tonight to go. This was not the quiet, solitary celebration of her retirement she'd planned. She had envisioned a peaceful transition, a slow fading into the background of a small town where nobody knew her name or the things her hands were capable of doing. She'd been promised a reset, a chance to unknow the things she knew about violence and the thin, frayed line that separated civilization from total chaos. But maybe Hayes had been right all along. Maybe there was no such thing as a peaceful transition for someone like her. Maybe once you'd been to the places she'd been, once you'd looked into the eyes of the things she'd hunted, there was no going back. There was no reset button for the soul. Her phone kept buzzing, a relentless series of haptic pulses that felt like incoming fire. Text after text began to flood in. Hayes, other guys from the teams, people she hadn't heard from in months, all of them seeing the video, all of them reaching out with a mix of dark humor and genuine concern. She ignored them all. She shoved the phone back into her pocket and walked toward her truck, parked a block away under the skeletal branches of a dormant oak tree. It was a beat-up Ford F-150, a nondescript silver beast she'd bought 3 weeks after retiring. It wasn't fancy, it didn't draw attention, and it was the most reliable thing in her life. She climbed into the cab, the smell of old coffee and cold upholstery wrapping around her. She sat there in the dark, the engine off, staring at her hands as they gripped the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. They should have been shaking. A normal person's hands would be trembling with the aftershocks of a physical altercation, their heart racing with the fear of what might have happened. But Morgan's hands were steady, her pulse a rhythmic, slow thrum in her ears. She wasn't normal. She would never be normal. And tonight, in the middle of the Langston Grill, surrounded by civilians recording her every move on their shiny plastic devices, she had finally accepted that truth. She started the truck, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble, and drove home through the quiet streets of Clearwater. She passed the mom and pop stores with their darkened windows, the coffee shops where she'd tried to learn how to be a regular, the parks where she'd watched children play and wondered if she'd ever understand that kind of innocence. She passed all the trappings of the life she had been trying to build, realizing with a sinking heart that the foundation was already cracked. Tomorrow she would wake up to 1 million views. Tomorrow her face would be on news feeds across the country. Tomorrow her desperate attempt at anonymity would be completely and utterly destroyed. But tonight, Morgan Vale drove home with a cold takeout container on the passenger seat and the ghost of her old self sitting beside her in the dark. It was a silent, familiar passenger, whispering that civilian life wasn't a sanctuary at all. It was just a different kind of battlefield, one where the rules were unwritten and the enemies wore suits instead of camouflage. By the time Morgan pulled into the gravel driveway of her rental house, the video had crossed the 1 million view mark. She knew this because her phone wouldn't stop screaming at her. It was a digital assault. Missed calls, text messages, notifications from social media platforms she'd barely touched since leaving the service. The noise was relentless, invasive, and it felt like being pinned down in an open field with no cover in sight. She sat in the truck for a long time, the headlights cutting 2 yellow paths into the peeling white paint of the garage door. Someone had titled the main video, "Navy SEAL Destroys 3 Men in Seconds." Another version, uploaded by a local teenager, was titled, "Don't Mess with This Woman." A third one, which was gaining traction on the national news sites, simply said, "Instant justice." Justice. Morgan let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded more like a bark. There was nothing just about any of this. It was messy, public, and dangerous. She grabbed the takeout container and stepped out into the night, the gravel crunching under her boots. The rental house was small and sparse, a 1-bedroom bungalow that was exactly what she had looked for when she signed the lease. It was a place to exist, not a place to live. No pictures on the walls, no personal touches, no mementos of a life lived. It was the home of a ghost, a transient space for someone who didn't know where they belonged. She set the container on the cold granite of the kitchen counter and, against her better judgment, opened the comments on one of the top trending videos. "This is what happens when you disrespect a warrior," one user wrote. "Those guys got exactly what they deserved." She showed incredible restraint. "Bet they won't try that again," another chimed in, followed by a string of fire icons. But as she scrolled, the tone began to shift, as it always did on the internet. The initial wave of support was being overtaken by the skeptics and the critics. "Excessive force much?" a commenter asked. She could have killed them, typical military mindset, always looking for a fight. "This is what's wrong with women in combat roles," a particularly nasty thread began. "They can't control their aggression in the real world. She's a liability to the community." Morgan closed the app and set the phone face down on the counter. She pressed her palms flat against the stone, feeling its chill seep into her skin. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. In through the nose, hold for 4, out through the mouth. It was the same box breathing technique she'd used before jumping out of C-130s into the blackness of a foreign night, before breaching doors in the narrow, blood-slicked alleys of Fallujah. It was a tool for survival, and she needed it now more than ever. The phone rang again. It wasn't a notification this time, it was an actual call. She looked at the screen. "Hayes." She swiped to answer, her voice sounding tired even to her own ears. "You saw it," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "Everyone's seen it, Vale," Hayes replied, his voice crackling with the distance. "You're trending on 4 different platforms. There's already a news article on the local wires, and Fox just picked it up. CNN won't be far behind. You become the main character of the internet for the next 48 hours. Great, Morgan muttered. Exactly what I wanted for my quiet retirement. Are you okay? Morgan considered the question. Was she okay? She had just been assaulted by 3 men, had defended herself with the clinical efficiency of her training, and had walked away physically unscathed. She should have felt some sense of victory, some spark of vindication. Instead, she felt exposed. She felt like someone had ripped the roof off her house and invited the whole world to watch her bleed. "I'm fine," she said. "That's what you always say," Hayes countered. "Because it's what you're trained to say. But we both know that fine is a lie we tell civilians." Hayes was quiet for a moment. In the background, Morgan could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of music and the muffled roar of voices. He was probably at a bar with the rest of the team, the people who were still in the life. They were living the reality she had tried to escape, a reality where the lines were clear and the mission was the only thing that mattered. "Look," Hayes said finally, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I know you're trying to do the civilian thing. I respect it, I really do. But Vale, you can't just turn it off. What happened tonight, that's who you are, that's who you'll always be. You can change your clothes and move to a town in the middle of nowhere, but you can't change your DNA. I defended myself, Hayes, that's all it was. You took down 3 guys in 4 seconds, Morgan. Most people can't do that. Hell, most trained professional fighters can't do that with that kind of economy of motion. You made it look easy because to you it is easy. And now the whole world knows you're a predator in a world of prey." Morgan opened the takeout container. The steak was cold now, the fat congealed into a white film. It looked unappetizing, almost grotesque. She snapped the lid shut. "What do you want me to say, Hayes?" "I want you to admit that you made a mistake," he said softly. "I want you to admit that leaving the teams was the wrong call, that you belong back here with us. The new guys they're bringing in. They're good, sure, but they aren't you. Nobody is you." Morgan felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one she had been ignoring since the day she handed in her gear. It was the pain of a phantom limb. "I'm done, Hayes. I made my choice." "Then why do you sound so miserable?" Before she could find an answer that wasn't a lie, another call came through. An unknown number. She ignored it, but 30 seconds later, another one popped up. Then another. Her phone was lighting up like a command center during a hot extract. "I have to go," Morgan said. "They'll wait for you, Vale," Hayes said, his voice fading. "The mission always waits." She hung up and powered the phone down completely. The sudden silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. It was worse than the noise because the noise was a distraction. The silence forced her to look at the room around her, to acknowledge the emptiness of her new life. She walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. She pushed past the civilian clothes, the soft sweaters and denim jackets she'd bought to try and look normal, and reached for a heavy plastic bin in the back corner. Inside were her dress blues, her medals, and her trident. She ran her fingers over the gold pin, the 3-pronged symbol of everything she had sacrificed. She remembered the day she'd earned it, the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of the final phase of training, the feeling of being forged into something new and deadly. Back then, everything had had a purpose. Every move was calculated, every day was a mission. And now she was just a woman eating cold steak in a house that felt like a waiting room. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door startled her. Morgan instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there, her hand hovering near her hip before she caught herself. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain back an inch. A sheriff's cruiser was parked in her driveway, its engine idling. The older officer from the restaurant, Deputy Martinez, stood on her porch, his hat in his hand. Morgan opened the door just wide enough to see him. "Deputy Martinez," she said. "Mind if I come in for a minute, Miss Vale?" She stepped aside, and Martinez entered, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced, professional efficiency. He took in the lack of furniture, the bare walls, the way she hadn't even fully unpacked her kitchen. He saw the signs of a soldier who hadn't truly returned from the war. "I wanted to check on you," Martinez said, leaning against the counter. "Make sure you were holding up okay after tonight." "I'm fine," Morgan repeated, the words feeling like a script. "That's the second time I've heard you say that in the last 2 hours, and I didn't believe it the first time either." Martinez sighed, looking at his boots. "Look, I know who Trent Halford is. More importantly, I know who his father is. Harlan Halford is the sun this town orbits around. He owns the lumber mill, half the real estate, and he employs about 300 people. He's got friends in the Capitol and friends in the courthouse." Morgan crossed her arms. "Are you telling me he's going to get away with what he did?" "I'm telling you to be prepared for a fight that doesn't involve fists," Martinez said grimly. Trent has been a problem for a decade, drinking, fighting, terrorizing women. Every time we cuff him, the charges vanish before the ink is dry on the report. Witnesses get sudden bouts of amnesia. Evidence gets lost in transit. Harlan makes it all go away because he doesn't like losing, and he certainly doesn't like being embarrassed. He grabbed me first, Morgan said, her voice dropping into a dangerous low. I know that, and the video shows it clearly. You were within your rights. But in this county, rights are often whatever Harlan says they are. He's got lawyers who can make a saint look like a sinner. They'll find a way to twist this, Miss Vale. They'll look into your past. They'll talk about specialized training and excessive force. They'll try to make you look like a ticking time bomb that finally went off. Morgan let out a short, bitter laugh. Of course they will. It's easier to blame the weapon than the person who pulled the trigger. Martinez shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. There's something else. That video, it's over 2 million views now. National news outlets are calling the station every 10 minutes. They want to interview you. They want the warrior woman story. I don't want to be interviewed. I don't want to be a story. I figured as much, but you need to understand the reality of the situation. You aren't just a person anymore, you're a narrative. And if you don't control that narrative, the Halfords will do it for you. They'll paint you as a violent vet with PTSD who attacked a local businessman's son. Morgan walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. Her quiet life was gone, incinerated in the span of a few minutes. What do you suggest, Deputy? Talk to a lawyer, a good one and one from out of town who isn't on Harlan's Christmas card list. And maybe. Martinez paused, his expression softening for a moment. Maybe don't go anywhere alone for a while. Trent has friends. They aren't as smart as he is, which is a frightening thought, but they're just as entitled. They might decide to take out their frustrations on you when the cameras aren't rolling. After Martinez left, Morgan stood in the center of her dark living room. She tried to remember what peace felt like, but the memory was gone, replaced by the familiar humming of a tactical mindset. The person she had been trying to become, the quiet civilian, the woman who lived a simple life, felt like a stranger she'd met once in a dream. She turned her phone back on, ignoring the avalanche of notifications, and scrolled until she found a name she hadn't called in months. Captain Jennifer Rhodes. Rhodes had been her commanding officer, the woman who had guided her through the most grueling years of her career. The phone rang 4 times. Vale, is that you? Yes, ma'am. I saw the video, Morgan. Are you all right? I'm fine, Morgan said, though she knew Rhodes would hear the lie. Stop it. I know you. I saw the way you moved in that grill. You were holding back, but you were still operating at a level that most people can't comprehend. What happened? Morgan gave her the brief, tactical summary, the harassment, the physical escalation, the response. Rhodes listened without interrupting, her silence the mark of someone who had spent her life making hard decisions. You showed restraint, Rhodes said when Morgan finished. Anyone else with your skill set would have broken those men's necks. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. It doesn't feel like I did the right thing, Morgan admitted. It feels like I failed at being a civilian. Maybe that's because you aren't one, Rhodes said softly. We didn't turn you into a weapon, Morgan. We just gave you the tools to be the best version of what you already were. You were born for this. You were born to stand between the wolves and the sheep. Why are you trying so hard to pretend you're a sheep? I just wanted a life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder. None of us get that life, Rhodes countered. Not after what we've seen. If you want to come back, I can make it happen. You're still the best operator I've ever commanded. There's a spot for you always. I need to think about it, Morgan said, her voice barely a whisper. Take your time, but don't go dark on me. Whatever the Halfords try to do, remember who you are. You're a trident wearer. You don't bow and you don't break. After the call, Morgan finally ate. She forced the cold steak down, treating it like fuel rather than food. It was about discipline now. She was washing the plastic container when the phone rang again. It was another unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but a gut feeling told her to pick up. Is this Morgan Vale? A woman's voice asked. It was professional, clipped, and practiced. Who's asking? My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a producer with Channel 7 News. We'd like to offer you an exclusive interview to tell your side of the incident at Langston Grill. It's an inspiring story, Morgan. A veteran standing up for herself. People need to hear that. I have nothing to say, Morgan said. I defended myself. That's the end of the story. But you're a Navy SEAL, Chen pushed. That's a huge detail. It makes you a symbol. You're a hero to a lot of people right now. I'm not a hero. I was a person doing a job, and I'm not a symbol. I'm a private citizen who wants to be left alone. She hung up, but the calls didn't stop. They came from every direction: reporters, bloggers, activists, and trolls. By midnight, she had retreated to the floor of her living room, her back against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest. It was the same position she had adopted in 100 different safe houses across the globe. Then a text arrived that changed everything. It wasn't from a reporter or a teammate. It was from a number she didn't recognize. "You made a mistake tonight," the message read. "My son might forget. I won't. You have no idea how small I can make your world. Harlan Halford." Morgan stared at the screen, the words burning into her vision. The threat was clear, calculated, and arrogant. It was the message of a man who thought he was a king, a man who believed the rules of the world didn't apply to him or his bloodline. Morgan didn't feel afraid. She felt a cold, familiar spark ignite in her gut. She stood up and walked back to the closet, pulling the bin into the center of the room. She didn't look at the medals this time. She reached past them and pulled out a small, black tactical case. Inside was a knife, a fixed-blade combat knife she had carried through 3 different deployments. It was perfectly balanced, its edge kept razor-sharp. She held the knife in her hand, feeling its weight. It was an extension of her arm, a tool she understood perfectly. Martinez had told her to get a lawyer. Rhodes had told her to come home. The news producer had told her she was a symbol. But Harlan Halford had told her the truth. She was a target. And Morgan Vale knew exactly what to do with a target. She sat at her laptop and began to work. If she was going to be in a fight, she was going to know everything about her enemy. She spent hours digging through public records, old news archives, and corporate filings. The picture of Harlan Halford that emerged was one of a classic provincial tyrant. He wasn't just wealthy, he was entrenched. He had bought his way into every corner of the state's infrastructure. She found the labor disputes, strikes at the lumber mill that had been broken by private security firms with unfortunate results. She found the environmental violations that had been settled for pennies on the dollar after meeting with judges behind closed doors. She found the stories of whistleblowers who had suddenly lost their homes or been driven out of town by unrelated legal troubles. And then there was Trent. The list of his transgressions was long and sickening. DUIs that were downgraded to simple speeding tickets, assault charges that were dismissed because the victim was uncooperative, a restraining order from a former girlfriend that had been scrubbed from the public record 3 months after it was filed. The Halfords were a cancer on this town, a legacy of corruption that had gone unchallenged for far too long. They thought they could silence her the way they had silenced everyone else. They thought that because she was a woman living alone in a rental house, she was an easy mark. Morgan closed her laptop, the screen light reflecting in her eyes like a predator's. She looked at the knife on the counter, then at the trident pin resting on her dresser. She had tried to leave the war behind, to find a version of herself that didn't require violence. But the world wasn't interested in that version of Morgan Vale. The world wanted the warrior. Her phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. "My lawyers will be in touch tomorrow morning," it said. "By the time they're done with you, you'll wish you had never been born. You'll regret what you did to my family." Morgan picked up the phone. Her hands were still perfectly steady. She typed out a response, her voice clear and cold in her mind. "Your son assaulted a woman," she wrote. "I defended myself. If you want to make this a legal issue, bring it on. But understand one thing, Harlan. You're used to fighting people who have something to lose. I don't." She hit send and waited. The reply came back 60 seconds later. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, girl." Morgan smiled. It was the same smile she had worn before jumping into the darkness over the Hindu Kush. It was a smile of pure, lethal intent. "Neither do you," she typed back. She set the phone down and walked to the window. The sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged peaks of the Idaho mountains, casting a long, gray light over the town of Clearwater. She knew that today would be the start of a different kind of war. There would be lawyers, there would be media circuses, and there would likely be men coming to her door in the dead of night. But as she stood there, watching the world wake up, Morgan Vale felt a strange sense of peace. The struggle to be normal was over. The charade of civilian life had been stripped away, leaving behind the only thing she had ever truly known how to be. She wasn't a victim, she wasn't a symbol, and she certainly wasn't a sheep. She was a Navy SEAL, and if Harlan Halford wanted to bring the fight to her doorstep, she would show him exactly what 16 years of state-sponsored violence looked like when it was directed at a single, deserving target. She had left the Navy, she had turned in her gear, and she had walked away from the life she knew. But as she watched the morning light hit the gravel of her driveway, Morgan knew that the war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new theater. And in this theater, there were no rules of engagement. There was only the mission. She picked up the knife, tucked it into the sheath at the small of her back, and went to the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. The hunt had begun. The transition from being a weapon of the state back into a regular citizen was supposed to be a slow shedding of skin, a gradual softening of the edges. But as Morgan stood in the quiet of her home, she realized that the warrior she had become wasn't a uniform she could just take off at the end of a shift. That person was permanent, unchangeable, etched into her very DNA at a cellular level. Every instinct, every hyper-aware scan of a room, every calculation of exits and threats was a part of her now. And maybe, she mused, that wasn't a curse to be endured. Maybe it wasn't something she needed to hide, suppress, or apologize for to make the neighbors feel more comfortable. Maybe it was exactly what she needed to survive the storm that was darkening the horizon of her new life. Morgan picked up the tactical knife from the counter, feeling the familiar weight and the perfect balance of the blade in her palm. She felt the edge with her thumb, a sharpness that promised purpose. Then, with a deliberate click, she put it back in its box and closed the closet door. She didn't need steel to fight this particular battle. She had something far more resilient. She had herself, and that Morgan, she was beginning to remember, had always been enough to tip the scales. The next morning, the air in the lawyer's office was heavy with the scent of old, leather-bound books and an expensive sandalwood cologne that spoke of high-priced retainers and closed-door settlements. Morgan sat in a deep, tufted leather chair across from Daniel Reeves. He was a man in his late 50s with a shock of silver hair and a demeanor characterized by a terrifyingly calm stillness, the kind of composure that came from winning bloody battles in mahogany-paneled courtrooms instead of dusty war zones. He didn't look like a fighter, but Morgan knew a predator when she saw one. Reeves didn't lead with pleasantries. Instead, he slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished surface of his desk, the paper whispering against the wood. "They filed this morning," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. "It's a civil suit. Assault and battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a laundry list of secondary claims. They're asking for $2.5 million in damages." Morgan picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the dense, convoluted legalese. It was a masterpiece of fiction, a narrative that twisted the reality of that night at the restaurant into something entirely unrecognizable. According to Trent Halford's legal team, Morgan was a rogue element who had viciously and unprovokedly attacked 3 innocent young men who had merely approached her in a friendly, neighborly manner. The filing claimed she had used excessive military-grade force, had deeply traumatized the plaintiffs, and had acted with nothing but cold, malicious intent. It painted her as a ticking time bomb looking for a reason to explode. "This is garbage," Morgan said, her voice flat and cold. She felt the familiar simmer of adrenaline, the fight, half of the primal reflex. Reeves leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Of course, it's garbage," he agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "But in the eyes of the law, it's official, filed garbage, which means we have to treat it with absolute seriousness. The good news is that we have the upper hand on the facts. We have video evidence from multiple angles, the restaurant's security, cell phone footage from other patrons. It's all clear. Trent Halford grabbed you first. You gave him multiple verbal warnings to stop. You only acted when he escalated, and you used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. On the merits, we win. However, Miss Vale, you need to understand the ecosystem you've stepped into. Trent Halford has been using the court system as a personal cudgel for 30 years. He files frivolous lawsuits like most people send emails. He doesn't actually care about a jury's verdict. He cares about the process. He wants to make your life an absolute, waking hell until you either settle out of court to make it stop or you simply give up and leave town." Morgan set the papers back down, her jaw tight. "I'm not settling, and I'm sure as hell not leaving." Reeves cleared his throat, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I figured you'd say that. Which brings us to the part you're not going to like. This is going to get incredibly ugly very fast. To fight this, they'll depose you for hours on end. They will question every single aspect of your military service, looking for any crack in the armor. They'll try to paint you as a violent, unstable veteran suffering from untreated PTSD. They will dig into your personal life, your past relationships, your medical records, and anything else they can get a subpoena for. They want to turn you into a monster in the eyes of the public. Let them dig, Morgan replied, her voice steady. They won't find anything because there's nothing to find. Reeves studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Everyone has something, Miss Vale, and these lawyers are world-class at taking a molehill and turning it into a mountain range. Morgan thought briefly of the missions she could never speak of, the classified operations in the dark corners of the world, the things done in the name of security that stayed buried in redacted files. My service record is sealed, she reminded him. For now, Reeves countered, but Halford's team will fight to unseal it. They'll argue that your specific training and military history are directly relevant to your intent during the altercation. Depending on which judge gets the motion, they might just succeed in prying that door open. The weight of the situation settled over Morgan like a suit of heavy body armor. Restrictive, cumbersome, and inherently uncomfortable, yet a necessary burden for the terrain ahead. She had come to Clearwater wanting to leave the echoes of war behind, to find a quiet corner of the world where the stakes weren't life and death. Instead, she realized she had brought the war home with her, or perhaps the war had simply been waiting for her here in the mountains. How long will this take? She asked. Months, Reeves said. Maybe years if they decide to drag their feet and file endless motions. And during that entire time, they will make sure the community knows every sordid detail of the allegations. They'll leak curated segments of the depositions to the local press. They'll do everything in their power to make you the villain of this story. Morgan stood up and walked to the large window that overlooked the main street of Clearwater. Below, she saw people moving through their Tuesday mornings, shopping for groceries, meeting for coffee, chatting on the sidewalk, completely unaware that one of their neighbors was currently being lined up in the crosshairs of the town's most powerful man. There's one more thing, Reeves said quietly, breaking the silence. I got a call this morning from a contact in the district attorney's office. They're officially considering filing criminal charges. Morgan turned back to him, her brow furrowed. Against me? For what? Assault in the third degree, Reeves replied. The DA is up for re-election next year, and Trent Halford just happens to be his single largest campaign donor. So this is purely political, Morgan said, the anger finally beginning to sharpen in her chest. It was a familiar heat, the same cold fury she had felt while watching corrupt officials in foreign lands abuse their power to crush the people they were supposed to protect. Everything is political when you're dealing with men who have both money and the lack of a moral compass, Reeves said. What do I do? Morgan asked. You let me handle the legal maneuvers, Reeves instructed. You keep your head down. Do not talk to reporters no matter how much they badger you. Do not engage on social media. Don't give them a single scrap of ammunition to use against you. He paused, his gaze softening just a fraction. And Miss Vale, please be careful. Trent Halford is a vindictive, small-minded man with a very long memory. I've seen him systematically destroy people's lives over far less than a bruised ego for his son. Morgan left the lawyer's office carrying a stack of papers that felt like a lead weight. As she walked to her truck, the realization hit her that civilian life was proving to be more treacherous than any active combat zone she had ever navigated. In the field, the rules of engagement were clear, and the enemy usually had the decency to wear a different uniform. Here, the threats were obscured by legal briefs and filed in marble-floored courthouses. When she reached her truck, she stopped dead. A long, jagged scratch ran from the driver's side door handle all the way to the tail light. It was fresh, the metal glinting through the torn paint. Morgan knelt down to inspect it. This wasn't the work of a stray shopping cart or a random act of teenage vandalism. The line was too deliberate, the pressure too consistent. Someone had taken their time to ensure the damage was deep. She stood up and scanned the street. There were security cameras mounted on the brick facades of a few storefronts nearby, but she doubted they would show anything more than a hooded figure in the shadows. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. Nice truck. Be a shame if something happened to the house next. Morgan didn't reply. She took photos of the damage for the insurance and the inevitable police report, then deleted the message. She got into the truck and drove home, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, checking for tails, watching for the next move in Trent Halford's petty, escalating game. When she arrived home, the house looked exactly as she had left it, silent and still against the backdrop of the pines. She cleared the rooms anyway, a tactical sweep born of habit and necessity. She checked the locks, the window seals, and the perimeter, finding nothing out of place. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted. It was the spidey sense of a veteran, the feeling of crosshairs settling between her shoulder blades in the moment before the first shot is fired. She sat at her kitchen table, the silence of the house feeling heavy and expectant. Her phone rang again. It was Hayes. "You need to come back to the city," he said, skipping the greeting entirely. "I just got off the phone with our contact at the VA, and she told me what's happening. The lawsuit, the criminal probe. Vale, you can't fight this kind of rot by yourself." "I'm not alone," she said, though she felt the lie in her throat. "I have a lawyer. A lawyer can't help you when Halford decides to send people after you, and believe me, he will. I did some deep digging this morning. This guy isn't just a local bigwig with a temper. He has documented connections to some seriously bad actors. We're talking organized crime, offshore accounts, drug trafficking routes through the northern border. He's not a businessman, he's a predator who happens to own businesses." Morgan felt her pulse quicken, her mind shifting into mission mode. "How dirty are we talking?" Hayes grunted. "Dirty enough that the FBI has had an active investigation open on him for 3 years. Money laundering, racketeering, witness tampering. But the guy is a ghost. He keeps everything at an arm's length. He uses layers of shell companies and fall guys. Nothing ever sticks. So he's untouchable in a courtroom," Morgan summarized. "Maybe," Hayes said. "Vale, you're not in a courtroom right now. You're in his backyard on his turf, and he's going to keep turning the heat up until you either run away or he burns you to the ground." Morgan looked at the bare walls of her kitchen, at the life she had been trying so hard to build. "I'm not leaving, Hayes. I spent my whole career being told where to go and when to fight. I'm finally in a place I chose for myself. I'm not letting a bully like Halford take that away." "Then let us help," Hayes pushed. "Let the team get involved. We can dig up the kind of dirt that doesn't show up in a standard background check. We can find his leverage and break it. We can fight him the same way we fought in the field." "That's illegal, Hayes," Morgan said, her voice firm, "and it's exactly what he wants. He wants me to cross the line so he can justify everything he's doing. So is keying your truck," Hayes countered. "So is bribing a DA to file false charges. This guy isn't playing by the rules of civil society, so why should you?" "Because I'm not him," she replied. "No, you're better than him," Hayes said, "which is exactly why you need to fight smart instead of just fighting fair." They argued for another 10 minutes, Hayes pushing for intervention and Morgan holding the line. She knew that once she let the team in, once she opened the door to the old way of solving problems, there would be no closing it. Once you started fighting in the gray, you could never really go back to the white. After hanging up, Morgan forced herself to go through the motions of a normal evening. She grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, eating mechanically while her brain ran through endless permutations of the situation. She was looking for an opening, a weakness in Halford's armor that didn't involve becoming the person he claimed she was. The doorbell rang at 7:30. It was a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet house. Morgan moved to the door with practiced stealth, looking through the peephole. Deputy Martinez was standing on her porch, but he wasn't in uniform. He was wearing faded jeans and a plain t-shirt, looking less like an officer of the law and more like a man who was deeply afraid. Morgan opened the door. "Deputy, can we talk?" Martinez asked, his eyes darting to the street. "Not here, somewhere private." 5 minutes later, they were in her living room. Martinez sat on the very edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly together as if he were trying to keep himself from shaking. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered. "If the sheriff finds out I'm talking to you, I'm done. I'll lose my badge, my pension, everything." "Then why did you come?" Morgan asked. "Because what they are doing to you is wrong," he said, looking up at her. "And because I've lived in this town for 15 years, and I'm sick to death of watching Harlan Halford treat this place like his personal fiefdom." He pulled out his phone and swiped through a few images before showing her one. It was a photo of Trent Halford, looking younger, maybe 20 years old. He was standing next to a girl with bright eyes and a wide, genuine smile. "That's Emma Gonzalez," Martinez said. She was 19. She worked as a waitress at one of the Halford-owned resorts and started dating Trent. 6 months into it, she showed up at the station to file a restraining order. She said he'd hit her, threatened her family, and was stalking her every move. "What happened?" Morgan asked, already knowing the answer. "The restraining order disappeared from the system before the ink was even dry," Martinez said. "Emma left town 48 hours later. No forwarding address, no goodbye to her friends, nothing. Her family says she just stopped calling." Morgan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You think Halford did something to her?" I think Harlan paid her enough to buy a new life somewhere else, and I think she was smart enough to realize that the money was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave, Martinez said. He swiped to another photo, a different girl, this one with a more haunted look in her eyes. This is Jessica Park. Same story. Dated Trent, filed a report, vanished. How many? Morgan asked. 5 that I can confirm through the old paper logs that didn't get digitized, Martinez said. Probably dozens more who were too scared to even come to us. Trent has a type, young, working-class girls who don't have the family or the money to fight back when the Prince of Clearwater turns into a monster. Morgan looked at the photos, seeing a reflection of her own struggle in those faces. These women had been silenced because they lacked the tools to resist. Why are you showing me this now? Martinez met her gaze with a newfound intensity. Because you're different, Miss Vale. You didn't disappear. You didn't take a payoff. You stood your ground and you embarrassed him in front of the whole world. That scares the hell out of Harlan. He's used to controlling the narrative, but he can't control you. So he'll try to destroy me instead, Morgan said. He'll try, Martinez agreed. And oh, you have something none of those other girls had. You have a platform. That video of the fight, it has 15 million views now. You've got national news outlets calling your lawyer. You've got people all over the country watching this. Halford can't make you disappear the way he did with the others because the world is looking at him now. You want me to go public? Morgan asked. I want you to fight, Martinez said. Not just in a courtroom where he owns the judge. Fight him in the press, in the court of public opinion. Expose what Trent is, and more importantly, expose how Harlan enables him. Shine a light so bright that they can't hide in the shadows of this town anymore. That would make me an even bigger target, Morgan pointed out. You're already the target, Martinez said, standing up to leave. At least this way you'd have witnesses. After he left, Morgan sat in the dark for a long time. She thought about Emma and Jessica and the others whose names were buried in dusty police files. She thought about the cycle of abuse, the payoffs, and the casual way power was used to erase human beings. Her phone buzzed again, an email from Sarah Chen, the investigative reporter. Miss Vale, I've been building a file on the Halfords for 2 years. I have proof of labor violations, environmental crimes, and credible accounts of witness intimidation. But I need a catalyst. I need someone with the credibility and the courage to go on the record. That person is you. Please call me. Morgan stared at the screen, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She could keep her head down and fight the legal battle quietly, hoping for a miracle in a rigged system, or she could go loud. She could use the viral fame. She never wanted to tear the veil off the Halfords' empire. The first option was safer, the tactically sound choice for a quiet life. The second option was a declaration of total war. It would make her a permanent enemy of the state in Clearwater and would likely end any chance she had at a peaceful retirement. But then she thought of the girls in the photos. She thought of what would happen to the next girl if she didn't stop the cycle. She opened her laptop and began typing a response to Sarah Chen, but a sudden rhythmic pounding on her front door stopped her. It was nearly midnight. In Morgan's world, no one with good intentions arrived at midnight. She moved to the door, the shadows of the house masking her movements. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she didn't recognize. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit that looked out of place in the woods, and he held a thick manila envelope. Morgan opened the door just a few inches, the heavy security chain still in place. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low. "Morgan Vale, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Harlan Halford," the man said. His eyes were cold and professional, the eyes of a man who dealt in transactions rather than emotions. "He'd like to make you an offer." He held up the envelope. $500,000. Cash, tax-free, deposited into any account you choose. All you have to do is sign a simple statement. You'll admit that the incident at the restaurant was a misunderstanding, that you overreacted due to your military background, and that you are deeply sorry for any harm you caused Trent and his friends. Morgan looked at the envelope, then back at the man. "And if I refuse?" The man's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Then Mr. Halford will use every resource at his command to dismantle your life. He will bury you in legal fees until you're bankrupt. He will ensure you never hold a job in this state again. He will make your daily existence so miserable that you'll find yourself wishing you had taken the money." "Is that a threat?" Morgan asked. "It's a promise," the man replied. "Mr. Halford is a very powerful man, and he doesn't like to be told no. I'd suggest you take this very seriously." Morgan looked at the envelope, then at the man's polished shoes. $500,000 to walk away. To admit she was wrong and let the monster keep his teeth. to become just another face in Deputy Martinez's collection of silenced women. "Tell Mr. Halford he can take his offer and shove it," Morgan said, her voice like grinding stone. "I'm not for sale." The man's expression didn't flicker. "You're making a massive mistake, Miss Vale. It wouldn't be my first," she countered. "This won't end well for you. We'll see about that." The man set the envelope on the porch and walked away without another word. Morgan watched him climb into a black Mercedes and disappear down the drive. She picked up the envelope and took it inside. When she opened it, she found a cashier's check for $500,000. But there was something else inside, a single high-resolution photograph of Morgan standing outside her lawyer's office earlier that day. It was a clear message: "We see you. We know where you are. You are never alone." Morgan set the check and the photo on her kitchen counter, right next to the tactical knife she had pulled out earlier. The threat was no longer abstract. It was physical, immediate, and personal. She turned back to her laptop and finished the email to Sarah Chen. "I'll talk on the record," she wrote. "But I want to do more than just tell my side of the fight. I want to expose what the Halfords have been doing to this town for decades. I want real justice, not the kind you find in a courtroom. I want the truth to burn them down. Call me." Her phone rang almost the second she hit send. "Miss Vale, this is Sarah Chen. I just got your message. Are you absolutely sure about this? Because once we air this, there is no turning back. The Halfords will come after you with everything they have." "I'm counting on it," Morgan said. "And you're okay with the risk?" Morgan looked at the check for $500,000, a ticket to a new life, a way to disappear and start over. Then she looked at the knife, at the military medals tucked away in the closet, and at the person she saw reflected in the dark window. "I spent 16 years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves," she said. "I'm not about to stop now just because the theater of operations has changed." Chen was quiet for a moment. "Okay, let's do it. Let's burn their house down." After she hung up, Morgan felt something she hadn't felt since her retirement ceremony, a sense of mission. The hollow, aimless feeling that had been gnawing at her was gone, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. She wasn't just a civilian trying to blend in anymore. She was Morgan Vale, Navy SEAL, and she had just declared war on the most powerful family in Idaho. Her phone buzzed with a text from Hayes. "Whatever you're planning, the team is in. We're already on our way. Just give us the green light." Morgan smiled. It was a real, genuine smile, the kind that meant she was ready for the fight. "Stand by," she texted back. "Things are about to get interesting." She walked to the closet and pulled out the small box containing her trident pin. She held the gold eagle and anchor in her hand, remembering the sweat, the blood, and the sheer force of will it had taken to earn it. Honor, courage, commitment. She had tried to leave those values behind, thinking they were only for the battlefield. But she realized now that they were who she was. She pinned the trident to her shirt, feeling the weight of it against her heart. Tomorrow, the interview would air. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. The Halfords would retaliate with everything they had, but tonight, Morgan Vale stood in her home and accepted her nature. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior, and warriors didn't run from the fight. They finished it. The interview was scheduled for the 6 o'clock news. Morgan spent the day in a state of calm preparation. She wasn't nervous, she was focused. She watched the broadcast on her laptop, a cup of black coffee in her hand, her pulse steady. Sarah Chen had done an incredible job. The segment began with the viral video of the restaurant fight, the footage grainy but unmistakable. Then it cut to Morgan sitting in a studio chair, the light catching the gold of her trident pin. Chen's questions were direct and uncompromising. "Why did you decide to speak out now?" "Because silence is a form of permission," Morgan said on screen. "I've seen what happens when powerful men are allowed to operate without consequences, and it ends here." Chen brought up the civil suit and the looming criminal charges. "I'm aware of the tactics being used against me," Morgan replied, her voice steady and clear. "But I'm more concerned about the pattern of abuse that precedes me." She spoke about the photos Martinez had shown her, about Emma Gonzalez and Jessica Park. She spoke about the women who had been paid to disappear, their voices bought and sold by Harlan Halford's checkbook. "What makes you different from them?" Chen asked. "I have the training and the resources to fight back," Morgan said, looking directly into the lens. They didn't. But that doesn't make their stories any less true. The interview ended with a bombshell. Chen revealed that her team had confirmed the FBI's ongoing investigation into the Halford family's business dealings, including racketeering and witness intimidation. When the news cut to a commercial, Morgan's phone began to vibrate almost immediately. It was Daniel Reeves. "You just painted a target on your back the size of the state of Montana," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and genuine concern. "I know," Morgan replied. "Good," Reeves said, "because Halford just issued a statement. He's doubling the lawsuit and demanding an immediate arrest for defamation. The war has officially begun." Morgan looked out at the darkening Idaho sky. "Then let's get to work," she said. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm. On the other end of the line, Reeves Morgan's voice was a low, urgent rasp, the sound of a man who had spent too many hours arguing in courtrooms and not enough hours sleeping. He didn't sound like a lawyer anymore. He sounded like a man watching a friend walk into a minefield. He told her that Halford wasn't just going to fight the lawsuit. He was going to escalate, to turn the legal system into a meat grinder designed specifically to chew her up and spit her out. The civil suit was just the opening salvo. Now they were looking at criminal charges, a systematic attempt to dismantle her life, her reputation, and her freedom. He warned her that Halford would try to destroy her, but Morgan simply took a breath, her voice steady as granite, and told him to let the man try. Reeves sighed, a long, weary sound that crackled through the speaker. He admitted he admired her courage, but in his world, courage didn't win cases. Evidence did, and he pointed out that she had just handed the Halford family the perfect ammunition to claim she was conducting a calculated smear campaign. Morgan questioned if truth could really be a smear campaign, but Reeves countered that in the theater of a courtroom, reality was often secondary to perception. He was on her side, he reminded her, but that interview had shifted the tectonic plates of their defense. They weren't just fighting a legal battle anymore. They were in a full-scale public relations war, and Harlan Halford had more money to spend on PR firms and image consultants than Morgan had in her entire life. As soon as she disconnected from Reeves, her phone became a live wire, vibrating incessantly in her hand. It was an explosion of notifications, a digital deluge from her old life. There were texts from Hayes and the rest of the team, messages filled with a mixture of congratulations and grim warnings. They offered to fly out to Idaho to provide security, to form a perimeter around her house that no process server or hired thug could penetrate. Morgan felt a swell of warmth at the loyalty of her brothers in arms, but she typed back a firm refusal. She had started this fight on her own terms, and she was determined to finish it the same way. She didn't want them getting dragged into the mud she was about to walk through. Then the screen lit up with a call from Captain Rhodes. When she answered, his voice was gruff, carrying the weight of decades of command. He'd seen the interview, and he told her she was either the bravest person he'd ever known or the most stubborn. When she asked if she could be both, he didn't laugh. He warned her that he had seen what happened when people went after men like Halford. It got messy, it got dangerous, and it got personal. He needed to know she was being careful, but when she gave her standard answer about always being careful, he snapped back that he wasn't asking about her tactical awareness. Morgan walked to the window, the floorboards creaking under her boots. Outside, the Idaho evening was settling in, a deep, bruising blue. 3 houses down, a car she didn't recognize was parked at the curb. It was a dark sedan, windows tinted to a mirror finish, sitting idle under a street lamp. It could have been a neighbor's guest, or it could have been surveillance. She told Rhodes she could handle it, reminding him of her training, but the captain's voice grew even more somber. He knew she could handle combat. He knew she could handle a physical threat, but this was different. This was legal warfare, character assassination, the kind of fight where your enemy didn't use bullets, they used your own history. He told her they were going to dig up everything and twist it into something unrecognizable. Morgan insisted there was nothing to dig up, but the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, Rhodes spoke the one word she had been dreading, Mossel. Morgan felt her chest tighten, the air in the room suddenly feeling thin. She reminded him that those records were classified, but Rhodes countered that if Halford's lawyers could petition a judge to unseal them, and if they succeeded, Mossel would be splashed across every headline in the country. The media would have a field day with the story of a female SEAL involved in an operation that had gone sideways. Morgan's voice flared with a rare spark of anger as she insisted it hadn't gone sideways. They had completed the mission. Rhodes didn't back down. He reminded her that Sanchez had died. 3 civilians had been caught in the crossfire. It had taken an after-action report 6 months to clear her of any wrongdoing. If that information became public, Halford's legal team would use it to paint her as a loose cannon, violent, reckless, and mentally unstable. Morgan closed her eyes, and for a split second she wasn't in Idaho anymore. She saw Sanchez's face, frozen in that final moment of shock. She heard the stuttering rhythm of gunfire, smelled the acrid stench of smoke, blood, and burning metal. She felt the crushing weight of decisions made in heartbeats that would echo through the rest of her life. She told Rhodes they couldn't unseal those records because of national security, but he warned her that Halford didn't actually need to win that legal argument. He just needed to plant enough doubt to make her credibility evaporate. After they hung up, Morgan sat in the deepening shadows of her living room, her thoughts trapped in the dust of Mosul. She thought about the mission that had been perfect until it wasn't, about the fine line between a hero and a pariah. The doorbell rang, the sound jarring in the quiet house. Morgan didn't move at first, her instincts instantly shifting to a defensive posture. She moved to the door and checked the peephole. A woman stood on her porch, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back and a palpable sense of nervous energy vibrating off her. Morgan opened the door only as far as the security chain would allow, her voice cautious. The woman introduced herself as Emma Gonzalez. She had seen the interview, and she said she needed to talk. Morgan stared at her, the recognition hitting her like a physical blow. It was the same face she had seen in the old photos Martinez had shown her, though the years had etched a hardness into her features. This was the girl who had vanished 8 years ago after dating Trent Halford. Morgan unlatched the chain and let her in. Emma sat on the very edge of the couch, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as if she were ready to bolt at any second. She confessed she shouldn't be there, that if Harlan found out he would come for her, but seeing Morgan on television had shattered her silence. When Morgan asked what had happened with Trent, Emma let out a laugh that was sharp and bitter. She explained that at first he was everything a young girl could dream of, charming, wealthy, making her feel like the center of the universe. But then, the mask had slipped. He had hurt her, controlled her, and systematically isolated her from everyone she loved. When she finally found the strength to file a restraining order, it wasn't Trent who showed up at her door. It was Harlan. He had arrived with a briefcase containing $200,000 in cash. The price for her silence was simple: drop the restraining order, leave town, and sign a non-disclosure agreement that erased her experience from history. Morgan felt a cold, hard anger crystallizing in her chest. She asked if Emma had taken it. With a voice that cracked under the weight of old shame, Emma admitted she had. She was 19, bruised and terrified, and a man with hundreds of millions of dollars was telling her that if she didn't take the money, she would regret it for the rest of her life. So she took the cash and she ran, living in hiding for nearly a decade. Morgan asked why she was coming forward now, and Emma met her gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She said it was because Morgan hadn't run. Morgan had stood her ground and fought back, and it made Emma realize she had been letting fear dictate her existence for 8 years. She was tired of being afraid, and she was tired of letting the Halfords win. Morgan looked at the woman and saw the terror, but she also saw a core of iron determination. It was a look she had seen in young recruits before their first jump into a combat zone. She warned Emma that testifying would violate the NDA, and Halford would surely sue her for every cent she had. Emma didn't blink. She revealed that she had kept copies of everything: the NDA, the bank statements, photos of her injuries, and even the threatening text messages Trent had sent her. She had carried that evidence like a burden for 8 years, waiting for a moment when it might actually matter. She told Morgan that she was the reason this was the right moment. Morgan had given her hope that these people weren't invincible, that someone could survive a fight with them. Before Morgan could respond, her phone rang again. It was Sarah Chen, her voice buzzing with an electric excitement. She told Morgan that 3 more women had called her, women who had dated Trent, women who had been paid off by Harlan. They had all seen the interview and they all wanted to speak. Chen realized this was far bigger than a single incident at a bar. This was something that could dismantle the entire Halford dynasty. After the call ended, Morgan turned back to Emma, asking if she was truly sure. Once the truth was out, there was no way to tuck it back in. Harlan would come for her with everything he had. Emma nodded, saying she couldn't keep living in the shadows, changing her name and fearing her own reflection. She had decided that survival wasn't enough anymore. She wanted to actually live. Morgan understood that distinction better than most. She knew the difference between just breathing and having a life. She knew what it was to carry trauma like a heavy rucksack you could never take off. She promised to connect Emma with Sarah Chen, but warned her that the situation was going to get much worse before there was any hope of it getting better. Emma replied that she had been living in the worse for 8 years, and at least now she was fighting back. After Emma left, the house felt even more exposed. The phone rang again, an unknown number. Against her better judgment, Morgan picked it up. A voice came through the line, calm and chillingly controlled. It was Trent Halford. He told her she had made a very big mistake. Morgan didn't flinch, noting that she had been wondering when he would call. He accused her of slander and defamation, claiming she had no proof. Morgan countered by mentioning Emma Gonzalez and the 3 other women ready to testify. That wasn't slander, she told him. That was a pattern of behavior. Halford's voice hardened into something like frozen iron. He threatened to sue those women into bankruptcy if they broke their NDAs, promising to destroy their lives and keep them in court for a decade. Morgan told him to go ahead because every lawsuit he filed would only prove her point, that he was a bully who used wealth to silence victims. Halford scoffed, reminding her that he had built the town, employed hundreds, and donated millions. He dismissed her as a washed-up soldier who couldn't handle civilian life, asking who would believe her over him. The old anger, the fire that had seen her through the grueling trials of BUD/S and the horrors of deployment, flared up. She told him people would believe what they could see with their own eyes, and 15 million people had already seen his son assault her. Halford dismissed the video, claiming his lawyers would prove she used excessive force, portraying her as a trained killer who attacked unarmed men. Morgan stood her ground, stating that his son had initiated the contact, and everything she did was self-defense. She told him she was looking forward to discovery because it went both ways. Her lawyers would subpoena his business records, his financials, and every NDA he'd ever forced a victim to sign. She asked if he really wanted all those skeletons dragged out into the light. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. When Halford spoke again, his voice was like ice, telling her she had no idea what she had started. Morgan replied that neither did he, and then the line went dead. She set the phone down and realized her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the massive surge of adrenaline. It was the rush of standing toe-to-toe with an enemy and refusing to blink. Her laptop chimed then, a notification for an email from an unrecognized address. The subject line was ominous. "You should see this." When she clicked the link, her heart nearly stopped. It wasn't her public service record. It was the classified one. It detailed every mission, every operation, and every kill. Someone had breached the Department of Defense servers and leaked her entire military history to the public. She scrolled through the document with a growing sense of nausea. Mossel was there in clinical, heartless detail. The mission, Sanchez's death, the civilian casualties, the long investigation. But there was more. Operations in countries where the U.S. wasn't supposed to be, targets eliminated in the dark, the dirty work required for national security that was never meant to see the light of day. It was all there, laid bare for the entire world to judge. Captain Rhodes called again almost immediately, his voice tight with a fury he was struggling to contain. He asked if she had seen the leak, informing her that NCIS and the CIA were already involved in a massive security breach investigation. He suspected Trent Halford was behind it, though Morgan knew proving it would be nearly impossible. Rhodes ordered her not to engage, not to comment, and not to acknowledge the leak existed. They were trying to scrub it from the internet, but they both knew how the digital world worked. It was already being mirrored, shared, and archived on 1,000 different platforms. Morgan closed her laptop, feeling as though the walls of her house were closing in on her. The careful wall she had built between her life as a soldier and her life as a civilian had been demolished. Rhodes told her to lawyer up and keep her head down, but the damage was already spiraling out of control. Her phone began to buzz with a relentless stream of news alerts. Outlets were picking up the story, and the narrative was shifting with terrifying speed. She was no longer the victim of a wealthy bully. She was being painted as a lethal weapon, a dangerous operative who had brought the violence of the battlefield to the streets of America. She forced herself to read the comments under Sarah Chen's video, and the vitriol was staggering. People were calling her a murderer, questioning why they should feel sorry for someone who had killed people overseas. Some said this was the inevitable result of turning women into weapons. The words blurred together into a cacophony of condemnation. Then Reeves called again, his voice sounding older than it had an hour ago. He told her the district attorney had just filed formal charges for assault in the 3rd degree, and they were seeking jail time. When she asked on what grounds, Reeves explained that they were using the leaked service record against her. They were arguing that her specialized training made her a deadly weapon, that she had a duty to show more restraint than a normal citizen, and that she should have walked away. Morgan pointed out that a civilian would have been assaulted, but Reeves said the DA was spinning a tale of a seal who couldn't control her violent impulses. She felt the trap closing around her. Halford had taken her greatest source of pride, her service to her country, and turned it into a noose. Reeves told her they would fight, that they would go to trial and argue that her background was irrelevant to her right to self-defense. But he admitted it was an uphill battle now that public opinion had soured. After they hung up, Morgan sat in the dark, thinking of the women who had come forward because of her. She thought about Emma and the others, and about the girls who might be next if the Halford pattern wasn't broken. She wondered if the warrior and the civilian could ever truly coexist, or if she was doomed to be the villain in any story that didn't involve a uniform. A text from Hayes broke her reverie. He told her the team was coming to Idaho, all of them. They weren't letting her fight this alone. Morgan started to type a response, her fingers hovering over the glass to tell them no, to tell them to stay away so they wouldn't get burned by her fire. But she couldn't send it. For the first time, she felt the crushing weight of the isolation, and she realized that even the strongest warrior needed backup when the terrain turned this treacherous. The doorbell rang again, and she checked the clock. It was nearly midnight. She picked up a kitchen knife, an old habit of tactical readiness, and looked through the peephole. An older man stood there, perhaps in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the late-night quiet. His posture wasn't aggressive. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped. When she opened the door on the chain and asked who it was, the man identified himself as Harlan Halford. He said he was there to apologize. Morgan stared at him through the narrow gap. The voice didn't match the one from the phone call earlier. That voice had been arrogant and sharp. This one was hollowed out. She told him she had just spoken to Harlan Halford 2 hours ago. The man on her porch admitted that she had spoken to his lawyer, a man he had allowed to handle the call because he was a coward. But he was here now, and he pleaded for a chance to talk. Against every instinct she possessed, Morgan unlatched the door and stepped back. Harlan Halford entered her living room, looking far smaller and more fragile than his reputation suggested. He clutched his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. He told her he had seen the interview and Emma Gonzalez's testimony, and it had forced him to realize something he should have faced years ago. He had failed his son, he had failed those women, and he had failed the town. Morgan was wary, telling him that if he was there to ask her to drop the charges, he was wasting his breath. He shook his head, stating he wasn't there to ask for anything. He was there to confess. He sat on her couch, looking like a man who had reached the end of a very long and very dark road. He explained that Trent was his only child, and after Trent's mother died when he was 12, Harlan had buried himself in his empire. He had given his son everything money could buy, but nothing that actually mattered. No discipline, no consequences, no moral compass. He admitted he had bought off the women his son had hurt, telling himself he was protecting the family name. But in reality, he was just protecting himself from the truth that he had raised a monster. Morgan sat across from him, her hand still near the knife she'd set on the table, and asked why he was telling her this now. He looked at her then, his eyes moist. He said it was because she was the only one who didn't take the money. She was the one who didn't disappear. Watching her fight had made him realize he had been fighting for the wrong side. He had spent millions making his son's problems go away instead of making his son accountable. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the coffee table. He told her it was a full confession. It documented every payoff, every NDA, every instance where he had used his political and financial influence to make criminal charges vanish. Every woman Trent had hurt and Harlan had silenced was listed there. It was signed, dated, and notarized. Morgan picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the lines of text. It was a roadmap of a decade of corruption. She pointed out that this document would destroy him, his reputation, his business, and likely his freedom. Halford nodded slowly, saying he was 72 years old and he was tired of being the villain. He wanted to do one good thing before he died, and that was ensuring his son finally faced the reality of what he was. Morgan asked what had truly changed in the 2 hours since his lawyer had threatened her. Halford's voice trembled as he spoke about Emma Gonzalez. He said that when he saw her face during the testimony, the fear and the trauma, he realized she looked exactly like his late wife had when she told him about an assault she had suffered as a teenager. He had spent so much energy protecting Trent that he had forgotten the pain of the woman he had loved. He stood up and walked toward the door, telling Morgan to give the papers to her lawyer, the DA, or anyone who would listen. He thanked her for being brave enough to do what everyone else couldn't. After he left, Morgan sat in the silence, the confession heavy in her hands. The world felt like it had shifted on its axis. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. Powerful men like Trent Halford didn't usually hand over the keys to their own prison cells. She called Reeves immediately, telling him he needed to get over there. Reeves arrived at 1 a.m, accompanied by 2 of his legal associates and enough coffee to keep them awake for days. They spread the confession across Morgan's kitchen table, treating the pages like a tactical map. Reeves was stunned, admitting that in nearly 30 years of practicing law, he had never seen a total surrender like this. He confirmed the document was a prosecutor's dream. It detailed witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. As they pored over the names and dates, Reeves looked up at Morgan, the steam from his coffee rising between them. He asked what she wanted to do with it. Morgan had been calculating the outcomes ever since Halford walked out her door. She suggested giving it to the DA, the FBI, and Sarah Chen to ensure the truth could never be buried again. Reeves played the devil's advocate, pointing out that if they did that, the Halford empire would collapse. 300 people in the town would lose their jobs, and the local economy would be devastated. One of the associates, a sharp young woman named Patterson, suggested a middle path. They could use the confession as leverage with the DA. They could negotiate a deal where Harlan agreed to testify against his son to ensure Trent went to prison, while Harlan paid massive restitution to all the victims. In exchange, Harlan might stay out of jail, and the business could be restructured or sold to keep the town's workforce employed. Morgan listened to the options, her mind tracing the potential fallout of each path. She thought about the weight of justice versus the weight of the town's survival. She thought about the women whose lives had been derailed, and the man who had finally, at the 11th hour, found his conscience. The fight wasn't over, she knew. The legal battle was just moving into a new, more complex phase. But as she looked at her legal team gathered in her kitchen and thought about her brothers-in-arms who were already on their way to Idaho, she realized she wasn't just a soldier in a foxhole anymore. She was the center of a storm that was finally blowing in the right direction. The digital world was still screaming her name. The leaked records were still being debated by strangers who knew nothing of the reality of the sand and the blood. But for the first time in a long time, Morgan Vale felt like she had the high ground. She looked at Reeves and told him they weren't going to let anyone off the hook. They were going to ensure every victim got what they were owed, and they were going to make sure that in this town the law finally applied to everyone, regardless of the name on their mailbox. As the sun began to peek over the Idaho mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the kitchen table, Morgan felt a strange sense of peace. The warrior was still there, but she was finding a way to exist in the light. The battle for her reputation would be long, the trial would be a spectacle, and the scars of Mosul would always be a part of her. But as she stood at the window and watched the mysterious sedan finally drive away, she knew she had survived the ambush. She wasn't just a weapon anymore, she was a witness. And the truth, once it was out in the open, was the most powerful force she had ever encountered. She turned back to the table, to the coffee and the papers and the people who were standing with her. There was work to do. They needed to draft the response to the DA, coordinate with Sarah Chen for a follow-up that would change the narrative, and prepare Emma and the other women for what was coming. The road ahead was steep, but for the first time since she had walked into that bar and felt Trent Halford's hand on her, Morgan Vale wasn't looking for an exit. She was looking for the finish line. The sound of a heavy vehicle pulling into her gravel driveway interrupted her thoughts. She didn't reach for the knife this time. She recognized the low rumble of the engine, the specific rhythm of the tires on the stones. She walked to the front door and opened it wide. Hayes was the first one out of the SUV, looking exactly like he always did, tired, alert, and ready for a fight. Behind him, the rest of the team piled out, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere of the property. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. They just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that went deeper than any legal document or public opinion poll. Hayes walked up to the porch, his eyes scanning the perimeter before settling on her. He asked if she was ready, and Morgan looked back at the house where her life was being rewritten. She looked at the sunrise, at the legal team inside, and at the brothers standing on her lawn. She told him she was more than ready. The war had changed, the weapons were different, but the mission remained the same. It was time to bring everyone home, and it was time for the truth to have the final word. Inside, the phone began to ring again. It was likely the DA or perhaps another reporter, or maybe even the lawyer she had spoken to earlier. This time, Morgan didn't hesitate. She picked it up, her voice clear and resonant in the morning air. She was no longer a ghost from a classified file or a victim in a headline. She was Morgan Vale, and she was done hiding. The fight for Idaho, for the women who had been silenced, and for her own soul was reaching its crescendo, and she was exactly where she needed to be. The legal strategy began to take shape with a newfound ferocity. Reeves, energized by the presence of Morgan's team and the weight of the confession, began barking orders to his associates. They were no longer just defending. They were going on the offensive. They would file a motion to dismiss the assault charges based on the new evidence of the Halford family's history of corruption and the manufactured nature of the excessive force claim. They would use the confession to trigger a federal investigation into Harlan's business dealings, ensuring that if the empire did fall, it fell into the hands of someone who would run it honestly. Emma Gonzalez returned later that morning, her eyes wide as she saw the small army of people now inhabiting Morgan's home. Morgan took her aside, introducing her to the team and promising her that she would never have to look over her shoulder again. The security Hayes and the others provided wasn't just physical, it was a psychological shield. For these women, who had been isolated for so long, seeing a group of people willing to stand between them and the world was the first step toward healing. As the day progressed, the narrative in the media began to crack. Sarah Chen broke the story of Harlan Halford's confession, and the public's fascination with the killer seal shifted into a collective outrage against the dynasty that had bought and sold justice for a decade. The leaked military records, rather than being the final nail in Morgan's coffin, became a testament to her service and the sacrifices she had made. The people who had called her a murderer were silenced by the voices of the women who called her a hero. The air in the house was thick with the smell of coffee and the sound of typing, a command center in the middle of the wilderness. Morgan stood on the porch for a moment, taking a breath of the crisp mountain air. She knew the trial would still be grueling, that the legal system moved slowly, and that there would be many more long nights ahead. But as she watched Hayes and Martinez running drills in the yard and heard Reeves arguing passionately on the phone, she knew that the battle was already won in the ways that mattered most. She had found her voice, she had found her tribe, and she had found a way to make the darkness of her past serve the light of her future. The story of Morgan Vale was no longer being written by her enemies. She held the pen now, and she wasn't going to stop until every word was true. The air inside the small kitchen was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the heavy, lingering weight of a long night spent in the company of ghosts and lawyers. Outside, the world was beginning to stir, oblivious to the seismic shifts occurring within the walls of Morgan Vale's sanctuary. She looked across the table at Daniel Reeves, his eyes bloodshot and his tie loosened, and then at Deputy Martinez, who sat with a hand resting near his badge as if seeking some kind of grounding force. The conversation had reached a standstill, a moment of profound moral clarity that felt as sharp as a blade. Justice, as they all knew, was often an imperfect, jagged thing. It was rarely the cinematic triumph people dreamed of. Yet, as Morgan looked at the sunrise bleeding gold across the horizon, she knew that an imperfect justice was still a far better outcome than the silence that had reigned over Clearwater for far too long. Reeves nodded slowly, his voice raspy from hours of deliberation. He pointed out the harsh reality of the legal system, noting that while they could push for maximum penalties and drag every secret into the light, the Halfords had the kind of resources that could stall a case for a decade. Harlan's lawyers would bury them in motions and appeals until the victims were exhausted and broken once more. Trent, ever the slippery predator, would likely find a way to plead down to a misdemeanor, a mere slap on the wrist for a lifetime of cruelty. In that scenario, the women who had suffered would walk away with nothing but more scars. But if they moved now, leveraging the absolute position of strength Morgan had built through her refusal to break, they could dictate the terms. They could guarantee that consequences would be felt and that compensation would be paid. Morgan stood up and walked toward the window. She watched the sun cresting over the rugged Idaho peaks, illuminating the town of Clearwater. It looked peaceful from this distance, a postcard of Americana, but she knew the rot that had lived beneath its surface. A new day was beginning, and with it came a choice that would define the rest of her life. She asked the only question that mattered: what did the victims want? She realized that for too long others had been making decisions for Emma, Jessica, and the others. This wasn't Morgan's story to finish on her own. It belonged to the survivors. By 8 in the morning, the answers began to trickle in, each one a testament to a different kind of pain and a different path toward healing. Emma Gonzalez didn't care about the money. The Halford fortune was tainted in her eyes. She wanted to see Trent behind bars, stripped of his arrogance and his freedom, facing the reality of a world that no longer bowed to his father's name. Jessica Park, however, wanted more than just a prison sentence. She wanted a public reckoning. She wanted both Trent and Harlan to stand before the community and admit, in no uncertain terms, exactly what they had done. The other 3 women, whose lives had been derailed and whose financial futures had been gutted by the Halfords' interference, sought compensation and the legal voiding of the non-disclosure agreements that had acted as muzzles for years. It was a complex web of conflicting interests, a puzzle that Reeves knew they had to solve by finding a middle ground that offered everyone a piece of the piece they were searching for. The silence of the kitchen was shattered by the shrill ring of Morgan's phone. It was Deputy Martinez. His voice was tight, urgent, telling her she needed to see what was happening on the news. Morgan grabbed the remote, her heart hammering against her ribs, and flicked the TV to Channel 7. Sarah Chen was on the screen, her hair windswept as she stood outside the Clearwater Sheriff's Department. This wasn't a scripted studio segment. This was raw, breaking news. Chen reported that only minutes ago, Trent Halford had walked into the station and surrendered to authorities. The charges were staggering: multiple counts of assault, harassment, and repeated violations of restraining orders dating back nearly a decade. But the real shock came next. Chen revealed that Harlan Halford had released a public statement just hours earlier, a document that read more like a confession than a press release. Morgan felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she watched the screen. Harlan wasn't fighting anymore. He was taking responsibility for the monster he had enabled. In an exclusive quote to the station, Harlan admitted that he had spent decades building a commercial empire while utterly failing to build the character of his own son. He confessed to using his immense influence to shield Trent from the consequences of his actions, an admission that he had betrayed every value he claimed to uphold. To the shock of the entire state, he announced the establishment of a victims' compensation fund, anchored by an initial endowment of $5 million. He admitted that money could never mend the broken lives, but it could provide the counseling and legal support that had been denied to these women for so long. Reeves let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair as he watched the broadcast. He remarked that Harlan hadn't wasted a single second once he realized the walls were closing in. Suddenly, Morgan's phone buzzed again, a text from Harlan himself. He told her he wanted to do one good thing before he died and thanked her for giving him the courage to finally face the truth. But the moment of grace was short-lived. A second message arrived from an unknown number, the words dripping with a different kind of intensity. It was from Trent. He told her she had destroyed his family and his life, vowing that he would never forgive her. Morgan set the phone down on the counter, the weight of the moment pressing in on her. She had set a series of falling dominoes in motion, and while the outcome was justice, the collateral damage was immense. A family was shattered, an empire was crumbling, and the very economy of the town was in a state of precarious uncertainty. Reeves sensed her hesitation and asked if she was okay. Morgan admitted she didn't know. She wondered aloud if she had truly done the right thing, or if she had simply burned down an entire town just to prove a point in a restaurant. Reeves gathered his papers, his expression softening. He told her firmly that she hadn't burned anything down. Instead, she had given a voice to those who had been silenced and held the untouchable accountable. She had shown every woman in Clearwater that fighting back was not only possible but necessary. He told her she wasn't destroying a town. She was building a better, stronger version of it. After the lawyers and the deputies left, Morgan sat in the profound silence of her kitchen. The last 72 hours felt like a blur of high-stakes adrenaline and emotional exhaustion. The confrontation with the three men, the viral video that had turned her life upside down, the leaked service records, and now the arrest of the town's golden boy. It was a lifetime of conflict compressed into a few days. Just as she began to drift into a weary headspace, her phone rang again. It was Captain Rhodes. He had news regarding the investigation into her leaked classified records. He told her they had found the source, and it wasn't Trent Halford. Morgan sat up straight, her mind racing. If it wasn't Halford, who was it? Rhodes explained that a Department of Defense contractor with a deep-seated grudge against female special operators had been systematically leaking records for months. NCIS had him in custody, and the charges against him were extensive. The timing with the Halford case had been nothing more than a cruel coincidence. But Rhodes added something that Morgan hadn't expected. The leak, which was intended to ruin her, had actually turned the tide of public opinion in her favor. Once people read the actual mission reports, the impossible decisions she had to make in the heat of battle, the lives she had saved, and the sheer scale of her sacrifice, they no longer saw a villain. The narrative had shifted. She was a hero again. Morgan's laugh was harsh and tinged with exhaustion. She told Rhodes she didn't want to be a hero, she just wanted her life back. Rhodes, ever the realist, told her that wasn't how the world worked. She was a symbol now, a figurehead for something larger than herself. The only question left was what she intended to do with that influence. When the call ended, Morgan stood alone, contemplating the weight of her choices. The doorbell rang, and for a moment she expected another reporter or a process server. Instead, when she looked through the peephole, she saw Emma Gonzalez. Behind her stood 4 other women, the survivors whose faces Morgan had only seen in the grainy surveillance photos Martinez had provided. When Morgan opened the door, she saw a delegation of survivors. Emma spoke for all of them, offering a simple, profound thanks. They stood on her porch like people who had crawled out of the wreckage of a storm, battered but still standing. Morgan tried to deflect the gratitude, telling them they didn't owe her anything, but Jessica Park stepped forward. She told Morgan that they absolutely did owe her, because she had fought the battle they were too broken to fight. She had risked her reputation and her freedom when they had already lost everything. One of the other women, Ashley, spoke up about their plans for the future. They didn't want the money to just sit in a bank. They wanted to use Harlan's fund to build something permanent, a program that offered self-defense, legal resources, and counseling for women in situations just like theirs. Morgan looked at the 5 women and saw her own reflection in their eyes. They were fighters who had been pushed to the edge but had refused to fall. They wanted to transition from being survivors to becoming warriors. When they asked her to run the self-defense portion of the program, Morgan felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This was the mission she had been searching for since she turned in her uniform. It wasn't about combat in a foreign land or serving on a Tier 1 team. It was about teaching people how to protect their own space and refuse to be victims. She looked at Emma and asked when they could start. The answer was immediate, as soon as she was ready. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of legal resolutions and shifting public perceptions. The district attorney dropped all charges against Morgan, recognizing the clear case of self-defense. The civil lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, clearing her name entirely. Trent Halford, realizing there was no escape, pleaded guilty to 8 counts of assault and was sentenced to 6 years in a state penitentiary. Harlan was charged with obstruction of justice, but his cooperation and the massive endowment of the victims' fund earned him a suspended sentence. The town of Clearwater was changing, and so was the story people told about Morgan Vale. She was no longer the killer from the leaked reports. She was a woman of distinction who had served her country under impossible circumstances. The Mosul mission, once framed as a failure, was now recognized for what it truly was: a successful operation that had eliminated high-value targets and saved American lives. Despite the flood of interview requests and book deals, Morgan turned almost everyone away. She only agreed to a follow-up with Sarah Chen, but on one condition: the story had to be about the new program, not about her past. They named the initiative the groundwork. The philosophy was simple. Fighting back began with the knowledge of how to stand your ground. The first class was held on a Saturday morning in a rented community center. Morgan had expected a handful of women, but when she walked in, 67 people were waiting for her. They were of all ages, from teenagers to grandmothers, but they all shared the same haunted, determined look in their eyes. Standing before them in her training gear, Morgan felt a sense of belonging that had been missing for years. She introduced herself not as a soldier or a hero, but as a woman who had been approached by 3 men in a restaurant who thought she was an easy target. She told the class that those men were wrong, and by the time these women finished the program, anyone who tried to intimidate them would be wrong, too. The room erupted in applause, a sound that resonated with the strength of a collective will. For 2 hours, she taught them the basics, pressure points, escape techniques, and situational awareness. But more importantly, she taught them that their safety was a right, not a privilege. She taught them that they didn't owe anyone their silence. Emma and the other survivors were right there with her, assisting in the drills and sharing their own stories of recovery. At the end of the session, a young woman, barely 20, approached Morgan. She was wearing long sleeves to hide the bruises on her arms, but her eyes were clear. She whispered that her boyfriend had done this to her and that she hadn't known she was allowed to fight back. She had thought she just had to endure it. Morgan looked at her and saw a version of herself before the world had taught her how to be strong. She told the girl that she could fight back and promised that they would show her exactly how. The girl began to cry, but it wasn't the sound of sorrow. It was the sound of a cage door opening. As the weeks turned into months, Morgan sat in the quiet of the community center after the classes ended, reflecting on the path that had led her here. The violence of the restaurant, the fear of the legal battle, and the exposure of her darkest moments had all been agonizing, but perhaps they were necessary. Perhaps the old structures of her life had to fall apart so that this new purpose could be built in their place. Emma often told her she was a natural teacher, but Morgan felt like she was the one learning. She was learning that the warrior spirit wasn't about the kill. It was about the protection of life and the restoration of dignity. The groundwork grew at a rate that surprised everyone. It expanded from a local class to a regional resource, incorporating legal workshops and job training. The $5 million fund provided the fuel, but the women provided the soul. Morgan's old teammates, including Hayes, eventually traveled up to Idaho to help. They volunteered their time to teach advanced courses and provide a different kind of male presence, proof that strength and support could go hand in hand. Even Captain Rhodes visited, observing a session and telling Morgan that she was doing more good in this community center than she had ever done in the teams. She was creating a legacy that would outlast any mission report. The statistics in Clearwater began to reflect the change. Domestic violence reports were up 40%, a number that initially shocked the town council until the police chief explained that violence hadn't increased. The courage to report it had. Women were no longer suffering in the shadows. They were coming forward because they knew they had a community that would stand behind them. The conviction rates rose because the victims were no longer easily intimidated into silence. During Trent Halford's sentencing, Morgan stood in the back of the courtroom with Emma and the others. She watched as Trent, stripped of his expensive suits and his father's protection, read a public apology with a trembling voice. It didn't matter if he was truly sorry. What mattered was that he was finally being held to account in the eyes of the law. The viral video that had ignited the firestorm eventually faded from the internet's short memory, replaced by the next cycle of news. But for Morgan, the impact was permanent. She was no longer a transient figure in Clearwater. She was a pillar of the community. She bought a small house, decorated the walls with photos of her friends, and placed her medals in a shadow box, not as a reminder of what she had lost, but as a testament to the journey that had brought her here. Hayes noticed the change in her during his visits. He told her she looked lighter, as if she had finally set down a backpack full of stones she'd been carrying since her first deployment. A year after the night in the restaurant, Morgan stood before a crowd of 300 people at the Groundwork's first annual fundraiser. The room was filled with familiar faces: Emma, the team guys, Captain Rhodes, Daniel Reeves, and even Deputy Martinez. Sarah Chen was there, documenting the evening. Morgan looked out at the audience and saw a community that had been transformed. She spoke about the night she walked into that restaurant, thinking her life of fighting was over, only to realize that she was just beginning a different kind of war. She told them that they were fighting for a world where standing one's ground wasn't an act of extraordinary bravery, but a basic expectation of life. The audience learned that in just 1 year, the program had trained over 800 women, and provided legal support to hundreds more. They had helped 90 women escape abusive households and rebuild their lives from scratch. When Morgan gestured to Emma and the original survivors, the standing ovation lasted for minutes, a thunderous acknowledgement of the courage it took to turn pain into progress. After the event, as Morgan stood outside in the crisp night air, she felt a profound sense of peace. The Navy, the deployments, the scars, and the scandals, they were all threads in a larger tapestry. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from a woman named Rebecca, a former student who had recently found the strength to leave an abusive marriage. Rebecca thanked Morgan for giving her her life back, admitting she was scared but finally free. Morgan's reply was simple. She told Rebecca that she had given herself her life back. The program had just shown her that it was possible. As she looked up at the Idaho stars, Morgan realized that the girl she had been, the warrior she had become, and the mentor she was now were all part of the same person. The warrior hadn't disappeared when she retired. She had simply found a new battlefield. The enemy wasn't an insurgent in a distant land or a corrupt businessman in a small town. The real enemy was the fear and helplessness that kept people small. Against that enemy, Morgan Vale was winning. She walked back into the fundraiser, her head held high, ready for whatever challenge came next. She knew there would be more women to train and more battles to fight, but she also knew she would never have to fight them alone again. She had built an army of survivors, and they were never backing down. She had found her war, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she was fighting for. The legacy of that night in the restaurant wasn't the violence or the viral fame. It was the ripple effect of a single person refusing to be intimidated. It was the realization that power didn't come from a gun or a bank account, but from the refusal to accept victimhood. Morgan Vale had spent 16 years learning how to destroy, only to discover that her greatest talent was helping others rebuild. As the lights of the community center glowed behind her, she knew that the groundwork had been laid for something that would last long after she was gone. The town of Clearwater was no longer defined by the family that had ruled it, but by the women who had reclaimed it. And in the center of it all stood a warrior who had finally come home. Every morning now, Morgan started her day with a sense of mission that felt different from the adrenaline-fueled briefings of her past. It was a quiet, steady burn of purpose. She would walk through the town, greeting the people who once looked at her with suspicion, but now looked at her with a mixture of respect and gratitude. She had become a part of the fabric of the place, the woman who had stood her ground when it would have been easier to run. The restaurant where it all began had changed ownership, and the new atmosphere was one of safety and welcome, a small but symbolic victory in the heart of the town. The groundwork continued to evolve, becoming a model for similar programs across the country. Morgan found herself traveling occasionally to help other communities set up their own versions of the program, sharing the lessons she had learned in the trenches of both military and civilian life. But she always came back to Clearwater, to the mountains and the people who had seen her at her lowest and helped her rise. She realized that the strength she had once used to survive missions in the Middle East was the same strength these women were using to navigate their daily lives. The scale was different, but the heart of the matter was the same. In the end, Morgan Vale's story wasn't just about a fight in a restaurant or a legal battle against a powerful family. It was a story about the enduring nature of the human spirit and the power of finding a new way to serve. She had left the military thinking she had lost her identity, only to find that her identity was something that couldn't be taken away by a retirement ceremony or a leaked report. She was a protector, a teacher, and a survivor. And as she watched a new group of women walk onto the training mats for the first time, she saw the future, a world where every person had the tools to stand their ground and the courage to use them. The transition from the shadow world of special operations to the bright, public life of an advocate hadn't been easy, but it had been the most rewarding mission of her life. She no longer felt the need to hide her past or apologize for the scars she carried. They were part of her, the marks of a life lived with intensity and conviction. She had turned a moment of crisis into a movement of hope, proving that even the most destructive storms could leave behind the fertile soil needed for something beautiful to grow. As the sun set on another year in Clearwater, Morgan stood on her porch looking out at the town she had helped save. The air was cool and clear, the mountains standing as silent sentinels over the valley. She felt a deep, abiding sense of contentment. She had done more than just survive, she had thrived. She had found her place in the world, and she had helped others find theirs. The warrior had found her peace, but she remained vigilant, a guardian of the ground she had claimed. And in the quiet of the evening, she knew that no matter what came her way, she would be ready. She was Morgan Vale, and she was no longer alone. She had an army of warriors behind her, and together they were unstoppable.